Greetings, fellow fans. You're tuned into Gringotts Hub, presenting to you today, what if a Gringotts blood ritual revealed Harry was the heir of Merlin, Slytherin and the last true king of all magic? Show some love by liking and subscribing. Enjoy the story ahead. Chapter 1, The Blood Doesn't Lie. The letter from the Order arrived on a Tuesday, which was the same day Harry decided he was done waiting. It wasn't one particular thing that pushed him over. It was the accumulation, 3 weeks of identical, useless letters that said we're handling it and stay where you are and trust us, Harry, written in different handwriting but carrying the same fundamental message: you are not important enough to be informed. Hedwig had stopped bringing them to him with any enthusiasm. She dropped them on his desk with a look that Harry could only describe as sympathetic and then go back to her cage to sleep, which was honestly the most sensible response to the situation. He was 15. Cedric Diggory was dead. Voldemort had a body again. And the people responsible for his safety thought the best strategy was to keep him locked in a house in Surrey with his aunt and uncle, who hadn't spoken directly to him since he'd arrived, and his cousin Dudley, who flinched every time Harry walked past him in the hallway. Harry sat on the edge of his bed that Tuesday morning, the latest letter from Mrs. Weasley in his hand. Everything is fine, eat your meals, we'll explain when you're older, all our love, and felt something very quiet and very cold settle into the center of his chest. He'd felt it before, briefly, at moments of absolute extremity. In the graveyard. Facing the basilisk. Standing over Quirrell. It wasn't calm, exactly. It was more like the absence of confusion. A sudden, total clarity about what needed to happen next. What needed to happen next was Gringotts. He didn't know why the thought surfaced at that precise moment. He'd been to Gringotts dozens of times, for school money, nothing else. He knew he had the vault his parents had left him. He knew there was some amount of gold in it. He'd never asked about anything else, because nobody had ever suggested there was anything else to ask about. But lying awake for 3 weeks in the dark, turning over everything he knew about himself and finding the picture didn't quite fit together the way it should, his mother's inexplicable wandless magic that had survived death itself, the Parseltongue, the way magic sometimes moved through him differently than it seemed to move through anyone else, too fast, too deep, responsive in ways that had nothing to do with training. He'd started to wonder whether the vault his parents left him was the only vault there was. He packed a light bag. Muggle clothes, his wand, enough Muggle money for a bus to London and the night bus fare back if he needed it. He wrote a note that said gone to Diagon Alley, back by evening, and left it on his desk for Hedwig to deliver wherever she thought appropriate. Then he walked downstairs, past the kitchen where Aunt Petunia was aggressively ignoring him over a cup of tea, out the front door, and down Privet Drive in the early summer morning like a person who had somewhere to be. The bus driver on the route into London gave him a look, a 15-year-old with a bag and a scar traveling alone at 7:30 in the morning, but said nothing. Harry sat at the back and watched the suburbs thin out into the motorway and felt the quiet cold in his chest stay exactly where it was, steady as a compass needle. Diagon Alley was nearly empty at this hour. A few shop owners unlocking shutters, a couple of witches moving briskly with shopping bags, an owl delivery service making its morning rounds. Harry walked straight down the middle of the cobblestones without stopping at any of the windows, past Madame Malkin's and Flourish and Blot's and the Quidditch supply shop, until the white marble steps of Gringotts rose up in front of him. The goblin at the door gave him the same look it always gave him. He returned it steadily and walked inside. The interior of Gringotts in the early morning had a different quality to it than during the busy school shopping rush of late August. The vast hall with its high chandeliers and rows of goblin clerks felt less like a bank and more like what it probably actually was, an ancient institution with its own gravity, older than the Ministry, older than Hogwarts, indifferent to wizard politics in the particular way that things which have outlasted many governments tend to be indifferent. Harry walked to the nearest available window. The goblin behind it was small even by goblin standards, with clever amber eyes that moved over Harry with the quick, cataloging attention that goblins seemed to apply to everything. Harry Potter, Harry said, because there was no point in being coy about it. I'd like to request an inheritance audit. A full one. Blood verification included. The goblin's eyes sharpened. It was subtle, but Harry had been watching for people, really, as a survival mechanism since early childhood, and he didn't miss it. A full blood inheritance audit, the goblin repeated. Yes. You are certain? I'm asking for it, aren't I? Something moved across the goblin's face that might, in a human, have been amusement. It tapped a small bell on the counter, a clear, high note that rang out and was immediately absorbed by the stone walls. If you would wait, Mr. Potter. Someone will come. Harry stepped back from the window and waited. He didn't fidget. He stood with his bag over one shoulder and watched the morning shift of Gringotts clerks working through their opening routines, and after about 4 minutes a door behind the row of clerk windows opened and an older goblin came through it. Older, in goblin terms, meant something different than older in human terms. This goblin was perhaps 3.5 feet tall, with a face so deeply lined it looked like carved wood, wearing robes that Harry recognized as finer than the standard Gringotts uniform, dark green with silver thread at the collar and cuffs, a long chain of office around his neck. He moved with the particular deliberateness of someone who had not hurried for a very long time and had no intention of starting now. Mr. Potter, the goblin said. His voice was deep and measured. I am Ragnarok, Senior Director of the British branch of Gringotts Bank. He looked at Harry with an expression that was impossible to read. You have requested a full-blood inheritance audit. I have. Do you understand what that entails? Not completely, Harry said honestly. I know it uses blood magic to trace lineage, and that it reveals any vaults or inheritances tied to your bloodline. I'd like to know everything mine reveals. Ragnarok was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone deciding what to say, Harry thought, but the quiet of someone deciding how much of what they already knew to confirm. Very well, the goblin said finally. Follow me. The room they took him to was not in the main hall. It was not, as far as Harry could tell, in any of the areas tourists or casual account holders would ever see. They went through the door behind the clerks, down a corridor that sloped gently downward, and then through a series of increasingly heavy doors, each one requiring Ragnarok to press his palm flat against a stone panel. The air grew cooler and the stone walls gave way to something older, rougher, darker, the kind of rock that hadn't been quarried but had simply been here, under London, for a very long time. The room they ended up in was roughly circular, about 20 feet across, with a high domed ceiling. In the center was a stone basin, waist-high, carved from a single piece of obsidian. The basin held a liquid that wasn't quite water, it had a faint luminescence to it, pale silver gold, moving slightly despite the still air. 4 other goblins were already in the room, standing at intervals around the basin. They were all wearing the same fine robes as Ragnarok. Harry took this in without comment. This procedure requires witnesses for any inheritance of significant complexity, Ragnarok said, as if anticipating the question. Standard protocol. He gestured to the basin. Please stand before it. Harry set his bag down against the wall and walked to the basin. Your right hand, Mr. Potter. 3 drops of blood into the basin. Nothing more. One of the other goblins stepped forward and offered Harry a small silver needle, the kind used for precise work rather than the theatrical daggers Harry had half expected. He took it, pressed the tip to his index finger, and let 3 drops fall into the luminescent liquid. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the liquid moved. It wasn't like anything Harry had seen in divination class, the murky, theatrical swirling of crystal balls or tea leaves. This was sharp and definite, the 3 drops spreading outward in precise geometric patterns, the luminescence brightening, the whole surface of the liquid beginning to rotate slowly, like a clock's inner mechanism winding up. Then it stopped. Then the light went white. Fully, completely, blindingly white, and then the white folded in on itself and became something structured, a column of light rising from the basin to the ceiling, and within the light, text. Not writing in any modern alphabet Harry knew, but writing he somehow understood anyway, the way he understood snakes, a deep comprehension that bypassed the step where you learned the language. He heard one of the 4 goblin witnesses make a sound. A single, low syllable, not English, not gobbledygook, something older. The goblin immediately pressed its lips together, but the sound had happened. Ragnarok was absolutely still. He was looking at the column of light, and his face, for the first time since Harry had met him 12 minutes ago, was unguarded. Harry read what the light said. He read it twice. Then he stood very quietly for a long moment, looking at the basin, while the light continued to turn and the room stayed silent. "Right," Harry said finally. Ragnarok turned to look at him. "Mr. Potter, give me a minute." Harry's voice was perfectly even. He pressed his bleeding finger against the side of his jeans, old habit, and looked at the text again. Not because he was having trouble understanding it, but because he wanted to be absolutely sure he was understanding it correctly before he said anything else. The column of light listed 3 primary lineages. Not secondary traces, not minor noble houses, not the sort of half-connections that old-money wizarding families paid specialists to find and exaggerate. 3 primary lines, running in his blood with equal weight, as if they had been building toward each other across centuries and had been waiting for this particular person to converge. The first was the Potter line, which he knew. An old family, respected, not extraordinary. The second was the Evans line, his mother's family. Which should have been Muggle-born. Which should have shown no magical heritage whatsoever, or at most a squib ancestor somewhere back in the family tree, the common explanation for Muggleborns. The light did not list the Evans line as Muggleborn. The light listed the Evans line as a dormant branch of the House of Emrys. Emrys. The family name of Merlin. The third line was on his father's side, not the Potters themselves but 3 generations back, a convergence that the Potter family had apparently not known about or had not thought worth mentioning, because people didn't generally think to investigate whether their great-great-grandmother had been a direct descendant of Salazar Slytherin through a legitimate line rather than the bastard lines that half the old pureblood families claimed. And beneath those 2, nested inside them, woven through both as if the 2 lines had always been moving toward it, was something the column of light listed in older text than the rest, in the alphabet Harry didn't know but understood anyway. Pendragon. High House. Last living heir. Undisputed. Harry took his minute. "How long have you known?" he asked. He was looking at the basin, not at Ragnarok. "Gringotts has held the sealed records for all 3 lineages," Ragnarok said carefully. The Emrys records were sealed by Merlin himself, with instructions to be opened only upon blood confirmation of a living heir. The Slytherin Trust records have been in our keeping since the founder's death. The Pendragon holdings were placed in trust after the fall of Camlin, with the same instruction, a blood confirmation would break the seal. He paused. "We did not know they would converge in the same individual. But the moment my blood hit that basin," Harry said, "you knew all 3 seals were breaking at once." "Yes. And the light going white, that happens often, does it?" Ragnarok looked at him steadily. "It has never happened. In any Gringotts branch. In any blood inheritance procedure in the history of the institution." He let that sit for exactly as long as it needed to. The basin is designed to scale its response to the significance of what it finds. What you are witnessing is the maximum response the basin is capable of producing. Harry looked at the column of light, still there, still rotating, patient as stone, and thought about 3 weeks of letters telling him to stay where he was and trust them and everything would be explained when he was older. He laughed. It was a short laugh, surprised out of him, and it had no bitterness in it. Just the genuine appreciation of someone who had just understood the full scale of the joke. "The vaults," Harry said. "All 3. What's in them?" "That," Ragnarok said, "is a significantly longer conversation. I would suggest, Mr. Potter, that you allow us to begin at the beginning." He looked at one of the witnessing goblins, who immediately moved to a cabinet set against the far wall and returned with a thick sheaf of parchment and a chair. "Sit. Please. This will take some time." Harry sat, because Ragnar was right, and he was 15 and he'd been up since 6 in the morning, and whatever was coming next, he was going to need to have his mind working clearly when it arrived. Ragnar talked for 2 hours without pause, and Harry listened without interrupting except to ask 3 questions, each of which made the senior director look at him with increasing respect. The goblin had clearly prepared himself for an emotional reaction, shock, denial, the usual human performance of being overwhelmed. Harry didn't perform any of that. He listened, he catalogued, and when he needed clarification he asked for it directly. The House of Emrys was the first order of business. Merlin, historically, not the storybook figure, not the doddering old man in the children's tales, had been born Merlin Emrys, a wizard of such fundamental power that even contemporary accounts from the 5th century had struggled to describe him accurately. He had not been a court jester or a court magician. He had been, in modern terms, the architect of the entire system of organized magic in Britain, the frameworks that would eventually become the Statute of Secrecy, the principles that Hogwarts founders had built on, the foundational theory of warding and binding magic that still underpinned virtually every major magical structure in the country. He had also, Ragnar noted with the careful precision of someone delivering information that had been under seal for 15 centuries, been a parselmouth. The ability had died with his line, or rather, it had gone dormant, which was a different thing. It had resurfaced twice in recorded history. Once in Salazar Slytherin. And once in the boy currently sitting across the obsidian basin from Ragnar. The Slytherin connection isn't through the Emrys line, Harry said, because that was one of the questions he needed to ask. No. The Potter-Slytherin connection is entirely separate. It comes through your father's maternal line, a woman named Cassiopeia Slytherin, born 1879, who married a Muggle-born wizard named Edmund Potter and took his name. The family lost track of the heritage within 2 generations. Cassiopeia's granddaughter was your father's mother. Harry thought about Voldemort's obsession with being Slytherin's heir. The theatrical, performed lineage, the careful cultivation of the mythology. The Chamber of Secrets, the title, the snake iconography spread everywhere like a brand. He thought about this with a particular, private quality of focus. He knows he's not a real direct heir, Harry said. He knows the line doesn't go through him cleanly. Tom Riddle is descended from a Gaunt, which is a collateral Slytherin branch, several removes from the primary line. Ragnar's tone was precisely neutral. The Gaunt line carried Parseltongue as a trait, which is consistent with their ancestry. But the primary inheritance, the vault, the titles, the formal founder's seat, those were never Riddle's to claim. They were sealed against false claimants by blood ward. He's been calling himself something that was never his. Yes. The third line, the Pendragon line, was the one that took the longest to explain, not because it was more complex than the others but because it had the most accumulated history attached to it, and because Ragnar seemed to feel that Harry needed to understand it fully. Arthur Pendragon, and this was historical fact, not legend, documented in Gringotts records that had been sealed since 542 CE, had not been purely human. He had been the son of a Muggle king and an Emrys line witch, which was part of why the legends around him had always blurred the line between history and myth. The High House of Pendragon had been the ruling family of all magical Britain for 2 centuries, not the political ruling family the way the ministry pretended to be, but the actual, literal magical sovereignty, the line that every major magical family in Britain had, at some point, sworn formal fealty to. When the line had appeared to die at Camlin, the fealty oaths had gone dormant. Not dissolved. Not cancelled. Dormant. Waiting, as blood oaths always wait, for a blood confirmation. Those oaths, Harry said slowly. They're still active. They cannot be unilaterally dissolved. They require either the death of the last heir, confirmed by blood ritual, or the heir's formal release of them. Ragnar looked at him. The last heir has just confirmed their existence. Which means every family that swore those oaths, will feel it, Ragnar said. Some already have. The oath pull is a physical sensation, Mr. Potter. It varies in intensity depending on the strength of the original oath and the closeness of the bloodline. Major houses that swore directly to Arthur Pendragon himself rather than to his descendants will feel it more strongly than those whose oaths are 3 or 4 removes back. He paused with the care of a man choosing his next words. I would expect that some notable individuals are having a rather uncomfortable morning. Harry thought about Draco Malfoy waking up with an inexplicable sensation he couldn't name or explain and felt a sharp, genuine stab of something that was not quite sympathy but was at least acknowledgement of the situation's irony. The vaults, Harry said again, returning to what was actionable. I want to see them today. Ragnarok didn't argue. All 3. All 3. It will take most of the day. I've got time. The Goblin director looked at him for a moment with an expression that Harry, after 2 hours of watching Ragnarok's face, was beginning to be able to read. It was assessment. Real assessment, the kind that didn't happen on the surface, looking at Harry's age, his posture, the way he'd taken 2 hours of world-altering information without once reaching for the reassurance of familiar frameworks. Mr. Potter, Ragnarok said. In my position, I have met a great many powerful wizards. I have sat across from men who believed themselves extraordinary. I have processed their accounts and their inheritances and watched them perform their self-importance for my staff. He picked up the sheaf of parchment. You are the first person I have told that they are the convergence of 3 of the most significant magical bloodlines in recorded history who has responded by asking what's in the vaults. Is that strange? It is, Ragnarok said, exactly the right response. They took a cart. 3 carts, actually, in sequence. The first dropped them at the Pendragon vault, which was on a level Harry had never been to, far below the standard customer vaults, in a section of Gringotts that felt less like a bank's basement and more like the underground of the world itself. The walls here were not brick or shaped stone. They were raw granite, and they ran with a faint heat, and the torches that lit the passage were not the standard Gringotts variety but something older, a blue-white flame that burned without consuming any visible fuel. The Pendragon vault door was not gold. It was not iron. It was made of something that looked, at first glance, like black glass, but when Harry stepped close to it, it caught the light of the blue torches and showed depth, layers, the way obsidian did but more so. Like looking into the surface of a lake at night and seeing not the surface but the bottom, not the bottom but the water itself, the full thickness of it between you and the sky. It will open to your touch, Ragnarok said. Only to your touch. It has been waiting for the confirmation. Harry put his hand flat against the surface. The door was warm. Not the diffuse ambient warmth of the granite around them, specifically warm, responsive, like something alive recognizing a particular person. Beneath his palm, the layers of the black glass material lit up, a slow deep gold that ran from the point of contact outward in all directions, finding its way through channels in the structure that weren't visible until the light inhabited them. The door didn't swing or slide. It simply stopped being in the way. The vault beyond was the size of a cathedral. Harry walked in and said nothing for nearly a minute, because there was too much to say and the scale of it made words feel inadequate. Gold, yes, more gold than Vault 713 had held at its most dramatic, but that wasn't the point. The gold was almost incidental, stacked neatly against the far walls like a detail someone had included because they felt they ought to. What filled the rest of the vault was something else entirely. Weapons, but not just weapons, objects with presence, the kind of presence that magic objects develop over centuries of significance, objects that had been important enough, often enough, to accrue their own weight. Books sealed in cases that glowed faintly with preservation charms. Items Harry had no frame of reference for but felt the significance of anyway, the way you feel the history of a very old building, in your skin, below the level of thought. In the center of the vault, on a raised stone platform, was a sword. Not Gryffindor's sword. Nothing like Gryffindor's sword. This was older, longer, with a crossguard that swept forward slightly at both ends, and a blade that showed no metal surface at all. It was perfectly transparent, like glass, except that glass did not catch light the way this blade caught the blue-white torchlight from the passage, did not seem to have depth that exceeded its physical dimensions, did not seem to be, fundamentally, present in the same way the rest of the room was present. "The sword of the morning," Ragnarok said from behind him. "The primary weapon of the Pendragon line for 8 generations. It is bound to your bloodline. No other hand can lift it." Harry looked at the sword. He didn't touch it yet. "Everything in here," he said. "Everything is yours." He turned to look at the goblin director, standing in the vault entrance with his hands folded behind his back. "How long will it take to do a full inventory?" "For all 3 vaults?" "A week, if we work efficiently." "Then let's start the inventory today and have it complete by Saturday." Harry turned back to the vault's interior, scanning shelves and cases and stacks with the methodical focus of someone making a plan. "I want to know what I have before I decide what to do with it." He paused. "And I want the full Merlin records, everything sealed in the Emery's vault. I want transcripts. Gringotts translation service, if the originals are in Old English or older. That can be arranged." "What's the fastest?" "For you." Ragnarok almost smiled. "We will prioritize." They moved through the other 2 vaults in the afternoon. The Slytherin vault was smaller and more focused, less opulence, more intention. Where the Pendragon vault was a king's treasure house, the Slytherin vault was a scholar's collection. Texts, instruments, sealed containers with labels in a neat, precise hand that Harry recognized, with a lurch of strange familiarity, as being similar to his own handwriting. Centuries of carefully preserved knowledge, arranged with the particular organizational logic of someone who intended their heir to actually use it rather than merely to own it. In the center of the Slytherin vault, on a pedestal much simpler than the Pendragon sword's platform, was a ring. A simple silver band with a green stone, and on the stone, carved with microscopic precision, was a serpent eating its own tail. The moment Harry's eyes landed on it, something moved in the back of his mind, not words, not images, but awareness, the same awareness he got when a snake was nearby, but wider, more structural. Like a door opening onto a room he hadn't known was there. "Don't touch that yet," Ragnarok said, and there was something in his voice Harry hadn't heard before, genuine caution. The Slytherin signet carries a contained intelligence. A seneschal, a magical guardian mind, bound into the stone. Salazar Slytherin spent 11 years creating it. Contact with the ring will activate it, and it will need time to understand the situation. It'll know who I am. It will know your blood. Whether it approves of you is a different matter." The goblin looked at the ring with something approaching respect. Salazar Slytherin was not a gentle man. He bound a piece of his own mind into that stone. "I would prepare yourself for a difficult conversation." Harry looked at the ring with an expression that was thoughtful rather than daunted. A piece of Slytherin's mind, locked in a ring for 1,000 years, waiting for the right heir. Voldemort, with his theatrical claiming of the Slytherin name, had never found it. Had never known to look. Had never had the blood to even open the vault. "I'll talk to it when I'm ready," Harry said. Wise. The Emery's vault, his mother's vault, the thought arrived with a quiet force that Harry didn't entirely manage to suppress, was the last one. It was on a different level again, not down but sideways, along a passage that branched off the main cart track in a direction that felt less carved than grown, as if the passage had formed by rock choosing to move aside rather than by any deliberate excavation. The door was wood. Ancient wood, dark and smooth, with no lock and no magical mechanism visible. It had a knocker, iron, in the shape of a dragon curled around itself. "Your mother's line," Ragnarok said, and his voice was quieter here. The Emery's trust passed to the Evans family in the mid-19th century, when the Emery's bloodline went Muggle-side for 3 generations. Your mother, Lily Evans, had no knowledge of it. She would have, upon reaching adulthood. It is standard protocol for Gringotts to notify account holders, but she died before we could establish contact. Harry stood in front of the wooden door and let that sit in him for a moment. His mother had been Merlin's heir. Had walked through Hogwarts not knowing. Had loved potions and charms, had been brilliant and warm and funny according to everyone who'd known her, had given her life for her son with magic so deep it had broken one of the most powerful dark wizards in history, and had done all of it without knowing that she was carrying in her blood the legacy of the man who had built the magical world itself. He knocked 3 times, on the dragon's head. The door opened on a room that was not the size of the other vaults. It was modest, not small, but not cathedral scale. It was more like a study. There were shelves of books, yes, and there were objects and instruments, but there was also a writing desk with papers still on it, though the papers were old and sealed under glass. There was a fireplace that was not lit. There was a window that should not have existed this far underground, and through the window was not dirt or stone but a landscape Harry didn't recognize, hills and a sky the color of late afternoon, with 2 moons. Ragnarok saw his expression. The window is a fixed vision, Merlin's preferred view from his tower. It doesn't change. A brief pause. It has been showing that image for 1,473 years. Harry walked into his mother's vault and stood at the desk and looked at the papers under glass and read the heading on the top sheet, written in a hand that was unmistakably archaic but somehow still perfectly legible. For my heir, when they come, and they will come, this is what you need to know. He stood very still for a long moment. Then he straightened up and turned to Ragnarok. How much of these documents can you have transcribed and ready by tomorrow morning? The goblin director regarded him with steady amber eyes. How much of them do you want? All of it. Ragnarok nodded, once, decisively. Then all of it. He left Gringotts at 5:30 in the evening, stepping out onto the white marble steps with his bag over his shoulder, blinking in the late afternoon Diagon Alley sunlight. He felt different, not larger, not more important. More accurate. Like a map that had been missing a significant portion of its legend and had just received it. He knew several things now that he hadn't known this morning. He was the heir of Merlin through his mother's blood. He was the heir of Slytherin through his father's line. He was, through both and through the old Pendragon convergence, the last legitimate heir of the magical monarchy that had governed Britain before the ministry had clawed its way into the vacuum left by the line's apparent end. His Parseltongue was not a scar side effect, not a dark gift, not an accident. It was inheritance, running through 2 separate lines, which explained why it had always felt more native to him than any other magic he used. And Voldemort, Tom Riddle, Marvolo's grandson, Gaunt's descendant, the man who had built his entire identity on the stolen mythology of a bloodline that had always belonged to someone else, was sitting in a rebuilt body somewhere, surrounded by his followers, believing himself to be the heir of Slytherin. He wasn't. He never had been. The thought should have been satisfying, Harry supposed. Instead it was just clarifying. One more piece of the picture that now had all its sections. He walked down the steps and into Diagon Alley and stopped at the first food cart he found, because he'd been in Gringotts for 10 hours and hadn't eaten since 6 in the morning, and whatever came next was going to require him to think clearly, and thinking clearly required food. He ordered 2 pasties and ate them standing at the cart, watching the early evening foot traffic of Diagon Alley flow past him, and planned. He wasn't going back to Privet Drive to sit quietly and wait for people to send him patronizing letters. That era was done. He was going to go back to Privet Drive to collect Hedwig and his trunk, and then he was going to Gringotts tomorrow morning for the transcripts, and then he was going to need to talk to people he trusted. Hermione, definitely. Neville, for reasons he hadn't fully worked out yet, but the goblins had mentioned that the Longbottom line had a historical connection to the Pendragon oaths, something he needed to investigate. And Luna, because Luna had once told him, in her particular way, that there were things in the world that people stopped seeing when they decided they weren't real, and that the things which had been stopped from being seen were always the things worth looking for. He finished the second pasty and tossed the wrapper in a bin and turned toward the leaky cauldron and the Muggle Street beyond it. The summer had just become a great deal more interesting. He was 3 steps from the leaky cauldron entrance when someone fell into step beside him, and he knew before he looked, something in the quality of the footstep, too deliberate to be accidental, that it was a deliberate approach. The man beside him was tall, middle-aged, with the weathered look of someone who worked outdoors and wore his age in his face rather than trying to avoid it. Harry didn't recognize him at first. Then the man's magic shifted, like a note struck at a particular frequency, and Harry clocked him, Mundungus Fletcher, with a glamour on, which meant the Order was having him followed, which meant the Order had noticed his absence and panicked. "Easy," the man said, dropping the glamour. Mundungus, bleary-eyed and vaguely sheepish. "I'm not. Look, Moody just wanted me to check on you, all right?" "Dumbledore's fine," Harry said pleasantly. "Tell Moody I'm fine. Tell Dumbledore I've had an informative day and I'll be in touch." "He's going to want more than Mundungus." Harry stopped walking and looked at him. Directly, steadily. The same quality of attention he'd been giving Ragnarok all day, the complete absence of performance in either direction. "I've had a very long day. I'm going home. I'll be in contact soon. Tell them that." Mundungus looked at him with the particular uncertainty of someone who had expected either panic or rebellion and had received instead something that didn't fit either category. "All right," he said after a moment. "Yeah. All right." Harry walked through the leaky cauldron, into the Muggle Street, and caught the first bus going north. In his bag, folded into a Gringotts envelope, was the preliminary summary of 3 vault contents and a sealed letter from Ragnarok confirming that a full transcription service was underway. In his blood, running through every cell the way all inherited things run, quiet and absolute and entirely his own, were 3 lines that had been moving toward each other for 1,500 years. He watched London past the bus window and felt the quiet cold in his chest, not as emptiness now but as clarity. Bedrock. The thing you build on. He'd come to Gringotts looking for an answer to a feeling that something didn't fit. He'd found out instead that everything fit perfectly. He just hadn't had the full picture. He had it now. Chapter 2, The Vault at the End of History. The transcripts arrived at dawn. Not by owl. Harry had specified Gringotts courier, and Gringotts couriers were not owls. They were small, fast creatures that moved between Muggle and magical spaces with the particular invisibility of things that had been doing it long enough to be unremarkable. The courier tapped on his window at 5:47 in the morning, left a leather satchel on his windowsill, and was gone before Harry had fully crossed the room. He'd slept 4 hours. He didn't feel it. The satchel contained 3 separate folders, each one sealed with a wax stamp pressed with the Gringotts mark. Inside the first, the Emery's transcripts, was a note in Ragnarok's precise handwriting: "These are the most urgent. Read them before you open the others." Harry made tea on the small camp stove he'd bought with Muggle money 2 summers ago when the Dursleys had gone through a phase of locking the kitchen, sat on his bed with Hedwig watching him from her perch with an expression of focused concern, and read. Merlin's letter, the one headed for my heir, was 47 pages in transcript. It had been written at multiple points across a decade, the dates recorded in the margins by whoever had done the transcription work, and it read less like a formal document and more like exactly what it was, a very powerful man who had seen a great deal of the world and its patterns, writing down what he'd learned for someone he would never meet. The first 10 pages were personal history, not the legend but the reality, the boyhood in Wales, the years of discovery and catastrophic early mistakes, the mentors who had shaped him and the enemies who had tried to destroy him and what he'd learned from both. Harry read this faster than he should have but couldn't help it, because Merlin wrote about being young and powerful and not understanding the full scope of what he was in a way that Harry recognized from the inside. The hardest thing is not learning to use what you have. That part comes naturally, if uncomfortably. The hardest thing is learning that the people around you, even the ones who love you, especially the ones who love you, will try to shape what you are into something more manageable. Not from malice, but from fear. Your power frightens them and they will dress that fear in the language of your well-being. Be patient with them. But do not let them succeed. Harry read that paragraph twice. Set it down. Picked it up again. The next section, pages 11 through 23, was magical theory, and this was where Harry had to slow down, because Merlin wrote magic the way a master builder talks about load-bearing walls, as fundamental structures that everything else rests on, and if you don't understand them you'll eventually knock down the wrong thing. The theory of deep magic, what Merlin called the foundation layer, the stuff that made the rules that wizards treated as immutable actually work, was dense and occasionally required Harry to read a paragraph 4 times before it settled into something he could hold. But it did settle. That was the thing. It settled with a solidity that normal magical theory never quite achieved, like puzzle pieces that had always been supposed to fit together finally making contact. Your magic is not a tool you wield. It is a language you speak. Most wizards learn 500 words of a language that has no ceiling and call themselves fluent. What I am giving you is not more words. It is grammar. Once you understand the grammar, you will see that there is no ceiling. He was on page 31, a section on the Parseltongue inheritance and its true nature, which was not a dark ability but a form of deep speech, an access point to the oldest layer of magical communication, the language that magic itself used before human beings gave it the framework of wands and incantations, when Hedwig made a sharp noise. Harry looked up. Hedwig was staring at the window with her feathers slightly raised, which was her signal for someone is coming and I don't entirely approve of who. A minute later, there was a knock on his bedroom door. A very specific knock, 3 short, 1 long, 1 short, which was the knock Hermione used when she was at his door but also extremely aware that she was not supposed to be at his door and therefore wanted him to know she was being sneaky rather than have him open the door and be surprised. He'd told her last night, in a letter that had said, something happened. I need you here. Don't tell the order. Bring Neville if you can reach him, and Owl Luna. Hermione, being Hermione, had apparently reached Neville by 6 in the morning and physically appeared at his aunt's house by, he checked his watch, 6:17, which was the fastest she'd ever responded to anything, including homework deadlines. He opened the door. Hermione stood in the hallway looking like someone who had packed a bag at 4 in the morning, which she probably had, still in her traveling clothes, her hair in a state that suggested she'd spent the journey reading rather than sleeping. Behind her, Neville Longbottom, a full head taller than Harry remembered and broader across the shoulders than seemed strictly fair for someone who'd spent the last year being terrorized by Umbridge's class, had his own bag and an expression of determined readiness. Luna's meeting us at the Leaky Cauldron at 9, Hermione said, instead of hello. I told my parents I was visiting your aunt, which they'll believe for approximately 48 hours before they start asking follow-up questions. Neville told his gran he was doing research. She looked at the leather satchel, the transcript spread across Harry's bed, the general atmosphere of a room that had been used for intensive reading since the small hours. What happened? Harry stepped back to let them in. Shut the door, he said. And sit down. I'm going to tell you something and I want you to let me get all the way through it before you start asking questions. Hermione sat on the desk chair. Neville sat on the floor because there was nowhere else to sit, pulling his knees up with the ease of someone who'd grown up in a large house and was comfortable with floor sitting. They both looked at Harry with the particular quality of attention that people give when they already know, from tone alone, that what they're about to hear is significant. Harry told them. He told it straight, no preamble and no performance, the way he'd told Ragnarok what he wanted at the beginning of the previous day. He started with the blood ritual and went through everything Ragnarok had explained, the 3 lineages, the vaults, the dormant fealty oaths, the seneschal in the Slytherin ring, the Pendragon sword. He told them about Merlin's letter. He told them what it said about the foundation layer of magic. He told them that Voldemort's claim to Slytherin's heritage was not just ideological theater but a literal genealogical lie, because the actual heir had been sitting in Gryffindor Tower for 4 years. When he finished there was a silence that lasted about 8 seconds. Oh, Hermione said. And then, in a completely different voice, the voice she used when a problem was clicking into focus and she couldn't contain the momentum of it, oh, that explains the Parseltongue. Not the Horcrux, or, wait, is it partly the Horcrux? But the primary source is the Emery's line connection, and the Slytherin line amplifies it, and together they'd produce something much deeper than either line separately. She stopped. Sorry. Go on. There's more, Harry said, because there was. He picked up the third folder, the Pendragon records, and opened it to the section Ragnarok had flagged with a strip of red ribbon. The fealty oaths. There's a list in here of the families that swore directly to the High House. Major oaths, the ones that will have activated the moment I confirmed the bloodline. He held the page out to Neville. Neville took it, scanned it, and went still. The Longbottoms are on this list, Harry said. I can see that, Neville said. His voice was very even. Third from the top, which Ragnarok says indicates the oath is one of the original direct fealty oaths, sworn to Arthur Pendragon himself. Harry paused. Did you feel anything yesterday? Around mid-morning? Neville looked up from the page. I thought it was, I had the strangest feeling, like something pulling. In my chest. I was in the garden and I nearly fell over, and Gran came out and asked if I was all right and I said yes. He turned the page over in his hands. Gran knew what it was, didn't she? I think she probably had suspicions, Harry said carefully. Whether she knew the full context, she'll know the Longbottom oath history. She's obsessive about family lineage. Neville's jaw worked for a moment. She never told me. To be fair, she had no reason to think the Pendragon line was still active. No, Neville said. Right. He set the page down on his knee and was quiet for a moment, and Harry let him be quiet, because that was the kind of information that needed a moment. The political implications of this, Hermione said, not breaking the quiet so much as starting a parallel thread, which was a Hermione specialty, are going to be extraordinary. The Wizengamot was built on the model of the old Pendragon Council. There are families on that council whose founding seats are directly tied to the Pendragon monarchy. If you claim your inheritance publicly, when I claim it, Harry said. Hermione blinked. Right. When? A beat. Are you not at all frightened by this? Harry thought about that honestly. No, he said. I think I would have been if it had been sprung on me without context. But I had 10 hours in Gringotts yesterday to let it settle, and I've had Merlin's letter telling me that the thing I spent 4 years being told was abnormal about me is actually the most native thing about me. He shrugged slightly. It's clarifying. It doesn't feel like pressure. It feels like the map finally has the legend, Hermione said quietly. He looked at her. Yeah. Exactly that. She held his gaze for a moment, and in the look was something he didn't often get from Hermione, not agreement or analysis, but simple, full recognition. Then she picked up the Emery's transcript from the bed with the careful hand she always used for books. Can I read this? That's why I called you here. They went to Gringotts at 9, the 4 of them, Harry, Hermione, Neville, and Luna, who was waiting at the leaky cauldron as promised, wearing robes with small golden suns embroidered around the hem and reading a copy of the Quibbler upside down with an expression of serene interest. She looked up when they came in, looked at Harry, and said, "Something found you." "More or less," Harry said. "I'll explain on the way." Luna listened to his summary with the same quality of attention she brought to everything, total, undefended, following the information with a kind of open tracking that never looked like the theatrical focus people performed when they were trying to appear intelligent. When he finished she was quiet for a moment, then said, "Merlin's heir." "Of course. The Raxperts around you have always been confused." Neville made a sound. Luna turned to him with a bright look. "They are. They don't know whether to treat him as a student or a sovereign, so they do nothing. You've probably noticed they leave him alone more than they should." "I had not," Neville said, "noticed that, no." "That's all right. You will now." Harry had called ahead, a message through the Gringotts courier system that Ragnarok had set up for him the previous day, and when they arrived at the bank's marble steps there was a junior goblin waiting to escort them, no window queue required. The other customers in the main hall watched their small group cross the floor with the mildly disgruntled curiosity of people who recognized preferential treatment without understanding the reason for it. Ragnarok met them at the door to the secure corridor. He looked at Harry's companions with an assessing expression that Harry was learning to read as, I am determining whether these individuals are relevant or complications. My advisors, Harry said, because it was simpler and more accurate than my friends, which was true but not the point. Ragnarok looked at Hermione, at Neville, at Luna. Miss Granger. Mr. Longbottom. Miss Lovegood. He turned back to Harry with the neutral expression fully restored. The Emery's vault first, as you requested. Your companions can accompany you as far as the vault entrance, but entry is blood restricted. Understood. Additionally, Mr. Potter, the Slytherin Seneschal. I suggest you consider activating it today. The ring will settle better if it's done while you're in the vault rather than away from it. Harry had thought about this on the bus in. Agreed. The Slytherin vault after the Emerys. They went through the doors, down the sloping corridor, through the heavy stone passages, Luna looking at the walls with frank curiosity as if the architecture of Gringotts' deep levels was personally interesting to her, which it apparently was, and down to the level where the Emery's vault waited. Harry knocked on the wooden door with the dragon-head knocker. It opened for him as it had the day before, and he felt Hermione's sharp intake of breath behind him when the warm light from inside spilled out into the cool tunnel. I'll be right back, he said. He went in alone. The vault was exactly as he'd left it. The fireplace dark, the window showing its impossible landscape, 2 moons in a late afternoon sky, the hills soft and golden, the writing desk with its papers under glass. He'd thought, coming back to it, that he would need a moment to adjust. He didn't. The vault received him the way a room receives someone it was built for. He went to the desk first, not because he'd forgotten to yesterday but because he'd deliberately left it for now, when he had more of the context from the transcripts. The glass case over the papers, Merlin's personal working documents, Ragnarok had said, the actual pages he'd written on rather than formal copies, lifted when Harry touched it and deposited itself gently against the desk's back wall. He carefully picked up the top sheet. The handwriting was not what he'd expected from a man 15 centuries dead. It was quick and practical, the writing of someone with too many ideas and not enough time, words abbreviated, lines running into each other, occasionally interrupted by diagrams that seemed to be arguing with the text around them. Beside the desk was a low shelf with 3 objects on it that Harry had looked at yesterday and chosen to leave for today, a bronze disc about 8 inches across, a plain wooden box with no visible opening, and a short wooden rod, not a wand but something older, carved from a single piece of blackthorn, the grain running in a continuous spiral from base to tip, worn smooth from what must have been centuries of handling. He picked up the wooden rod. He felt it the way you feel something that's been resonating at your exact frequency, not a shock but a recognition, like hearing a note played that matches a sound you've been making under your breath without realizing it. The rod was warm and it was aware, not with the specific consciousness of the seneschal but with something more diffuse, the accumulated attunement of a tool that had been used by someone of his exact magical signature for decades. Merlin's focus, Ragnarok had mentioned in passing. Not a wand but a focus, an older tradition, pre-wand, where the magical anchor was less standardized, more personal. The wand maker's philosophy was that the wand chose the wizard. The focus tradition was different, the wizard made the focus, shaped it over years of use, and it became a record of everything they'd learned. Harry wrapped his hand around it and said, quietly, to the vault walls, hello. Nothing answered out loud. But the warmth in the rod increased slightly, and the fireplace lit, and the 2 moons through the window moved, a few degrees toward each other, like recognition. He set the rod carefully in the inside pocket of his jacket, against his ribs. He took the bronze disc and the wooden box and tucked them into his bag. Then he sat at Merlin's desk and spent 22 minutes reading the working papers under the new light of the fireplace, making notes in his own hand on the blank paper he'd brought, moving quickly and with the particular attention quality he'd been developing since the early hours, the one that felt less like learning and more like remembering. When he'd taken everything he needed, he stood, said goodbye to the room, which felt absurd and also entirely natural, and walked back out to where Hermione, Neville, and Luna were waiting. Hermione looked at his face, then at the slight difference in his jacket's drape. You took something. 3 things. I'll show you later. He turned to Ragnarok. Slytherin Vault. The Slytherin Vault had the same quality it had yesterday, focused, intentional, the accumulated precision of a man who had built things to last. Harry's companion stayed at the entrance as Ragnarok had stipulated, though Hermione craned her neck to look at the shelves with an expression of barely contained scholarly anguish. The ring was on its pedestal in the center of the vault, exactly where it had been. Harry walked to it, stopped, and looked at it. "All right," he said quietly, to no one visible. "Let's do this." He picked up the ring and put it on. For approximately half a second, nothing happened. Then everything happened at once. The sensation was not magical in the way spells were magical, it was deeper than that, a full system event, a sudden presence in his mind the way a person stepping into a quiet room changes the quality of the silence. Not invasion, not attack. Presence. Old, enormous, precise, with the particular quality of something that had been compressed into a small space for a very long time and was now, carefully, and with great deliberateness, expanding to fill the available volume. "So," said a voice in his mind, and it was not a voice exactly but more the impression of a voice, the texture of speech, the cadence of particular thought patterns, without anything so crude as sound. "You took long enough." Harry stood still and let the presence settle. "I didn't know you existed until yesterday," he said aloud, which he chose because it felt more grounded, more genuinely conversational, than trying to think in the direction of the ring. "I know. I have been watching. You have your mother's instincts and your father's stubbornness, which is a useful combination. You also have the Emery signature, which I did not expect. That changes things considerably." "In what way?" A pause that felt like assessment rather than hesitation. "I expected to be meeting a Slytherin heir. I am instead meeting the convergence point. That is a rather different conversation. Is that a problem?" "No." The voice impression shifted slightly, not warmth, exactly, but something that moved in that direction. Salazar would have found it satisfying. He spent his life believing the lines would eventually meet in someone who could actually use them. He was more optimistic about humanity's long game than he was generally given credit for. The history books aren't exactly kind to him. History books, the voice said, with a quality that was recognizably a form of contempt but so old and controlled it had become something closer to amusement. Salazar Slytherin was not a kind man. He was precise, he was demanding, he was unforgiving of stupidity, and he held positions on blood purity that were a product of his time and that I do not endorse. He was also the finest practical magical theorist of the Hogwarts era. He genuinely loved the students who worked hard, and he would be revolted beyond words by Tom Riddle. Harry blinked. "Tom Riddle used your founder's name as a brand. A costume." "I am aware. A beat. Salazar built this ring to wait for his true heir. He built it knowing that the heir might not come for centuries. He also built into it a countermeasure. If the Slytherin name was claimed by a false heir, a pretender, I was to observe them and when the true heir arrived, to provide a full account." The voice paused with the weight of something significant. "I have observed Tom Riddle for over 50 years, Mr. Potter. Every act, every claim, every atrocity committed in the name I was made to protect. I have a great deal to tell you." Harry was quiet for a moment, doing the math on what a full account meant from a consciousness that had been watching Voldemort for 50 years. "Not today," he said. "But soon." "Agreed. You have other priorities today." Something shifted in the presence, not withdrawal but a settling, like someone choosing a more comfortable seated position. "I will be here. I have been here for 1,000 years. I can wait another few days." "What do I call you?" "I have been called the Arbiter." Salazar chose the name. "It is accurate enough." A pause. "You may also call me what he called me in private, if you prefer." "He called me Kale." "Kale," Harry said. "Yes. That will do." The presence didn't leave, it simply moved to the background, still present but quiet, the way a person in a room can be present without demanding attention. Harry turned to look at the rest of the vault with a slightly different perspective, aware that Cale was cataloging his reactions with the careful attention of someone learning a new person. He spent 40 minutes in the Slytherin vault. He took 3 books, sealed texts, older than anything in the Hogwarts library, on magical theory that made even the Merlin transcripts look like introductory work, and a long flat case that held what appeared to be a set of instruments for a type of magical working he didn't yet have a name for. He also found, on a shelf at the back of the vault, something that stopped him cold, a series of stone tablets, not engraved but inscribed in what looked like dried blood, with text he couldn't read. Parseltongue, Cale said. Written form. Those are Salazar's personal annotations on the Founder's Charter, his real reasons for leaving Hogwarts, not the version that was preserved in the school's official history. Can I read them? You will be able to within a week of practicing the written form. The oral Parseltongue you have is a foundation. Written Parseltongue is a skill built on it, but it requires deliberate practice to develop. A brief pause. I can teach you. Good. Harry picked up the stone tablets with careful hands. They're coming with us. They regrouped outside both vaults in the corridor, Harry with his bag noticeably heavier, and walked together back toward the cart level. Ragnarok had been speaking quietly with one of the witness goblins while they waited, and fell into step beside Harry with the ease of someone resuming an ongoing conversation. The Pendragon vault, Harry said. Ragnarok nodded. Today. There is a matter to address first. The goblin's voice dropped slightly, not for secrecy but for the shift in register that indicated the shift in subject. The Ministry has sent a formal inquiry to Gringotts this morning. They are asking whether you were here yesterday, under what circumstances, and what services were provided. Harry looked at him. And? Gringotts does not disclose client information to government bodies without a court order. Ragnarok's expression was what it always was, impassive, but there was something in his stillness that suggested deep, ancient institutional satisfaction. They will not receive a court order because the Ministry has no legal jurisdiction over internal Gringotts procedures. This is one of the terms of the original treaty, signed in 1718, which has never been successfully challenged. He paused. However, they are aware that something significant occurred. Someone in the bank talked, not about the specifics, but about the fact of the duration of your visit and the level of directorship involvement. You should assume Dumbledore knows you were here. Harry had expected this. Fine. You're not concerned? Hermione asked from behind him. He'll want to talk to me. That's fine. I have things to say to him too. Harry kept walking. But I'm not talking to him until I've seen the Pendragon vault and I know what I have. The Pendragon vault's door lit gold again at Harry's touch. This time, with Hermione and Neville and Luna behind him at the threshold, the scale of the space hit differently. He heard Hermione's quiet exhale. He heard Neville make a sound that might have been a word but wasn't quite. Luna simply walked forward 2 steps into the entrance and looked around with her wide, collecting eyes. It smells like very old books and something like lightning, Luna said. And there's something here that's been waiting. Several things, Harry said. He went to the sword. He'd left it yesterday as a deliberate choice. He'd known, looking at it, that picking it up was a threshold action, the kind you should only cross when you mean it. Today he crossed the vault floor with his bag on his shoulder and his hand already open, and he wrapped his fingers around the hilt of the Pendragon's sword before he'd fully stopped walking. The effect was not dramatic. There was no flash of light, no sound, no visible magic. The sword simply lifted, perfectly balanced, as if it weighed nothing at all, though Harry could feel that it weighed exactly the right amount, not light but balanced to the specific proportions of whoever was holding it. The transparent blade caught the vault's light and broke it into components Harry couldn't name, colors that weren't quite colors, frequencies of light that the human eye wasn't meant to identify but that his magic could somehow track. He stood with the sword in his right hand and felt, in his chest, the quiet cold, his compass needle, give a single, deep pulse. Like a clock striking the hour. That, Cale said, with something that was unmistakably genuine feeling bleeding through the controlled texture of the seneschal's voice, is what Salazar spent his last years hoping to see. Harry turned and looked at his friends in the vault entrance. Hermione with her hand pressed flat against her sternum, doing the thing she did when something moved her that she wasn't going to admit moved her. Neville standing perfectly straight, and Harry noticed, had been noticing, piece by piece, that Neville's posture had been changing since this morning, something resolving in him as context arrived, the stoop that usually accompanied his self-consciousness simply not present today. Luna looking at the sword with the interested equanimity she brought to everything extraordinary. "Right," Harry said. "Let's get to work." They spent 5 hours in the Pendragon vault. Hermione approached it the way she approached every archive, systematically, with the reverence of someone who understood that what was in front of her was irreplaceable, but also with the practical focus of someone who needed to extract information and would not be paralyzed by the irreplaceability. She found the historical records section within the first half hour, floor-to-ceiling shelves at the vault's back left, organized by era, and settled into it with the focused joy of someone who had waited their whole life to find a library that told the truth. What she found in those 5 hours, working through the records while Harry and Neville went through the magical objects and weapons sections with Ragnarok cataloging beside them, was enough to fundamentally alter her understanding of British magical history, and she communicated this in a steady, urgent undertone that Harry listened to while simultaneously evaluating a warding device that looked like a compass but functioned as something much more complex. The Wizengamot was not an independent democratic body, she said, 40 minutes in. It was the Pendragon Advisory Council, restructured after the monarchy appeared to end. The seats on the Wizengamot, the ancient and noble houses, those are the direct descendants of the council members. They've been operating as a democracy for 400 years, but the foundational structure was always monarchical. The positions have the powers they have because they were designed to advise a king, not to govern themselves. Which means? Harry said, not looking up from the compass device. Which means the entire constitutional basis of modern wizarding governance is technically a holding structure, waiting for a legitimate monarch to exist again. She turned a page. Harry. The chief warlock position that Dumbledore holds, that position was created as a regent role. It was literally designed to be held by someone acting in place of the Pendragon heir until the heir came of age. She looked up. He's been sitting in your seat. Harry looked up from the compass device. Held her gaze for a moment. Does he know that? I don't know. He might. A pause. He might have thought the line was permanently extinct. He knew, Cale said quietly. Harry said aloud, Cale says Dumbledore knew. Hermione stared at him. The ring? Seneschal. Long story. But yes. Harry set the compass device down and turned it over in his hands, looking at the underside, which had engraving that started to make sense the more his eyes tracked the pattern. We'll deal with Dumbledore separately. Keep reading. Luna, meanwhile, had found the vault section that seemed to function less like an archive and more like a reliquary, objects that weren't weapons or books, things that existed primarily as concentrations of symbolic power. She spent the 5 hours there in near silence, picking things up, setting them down, occasionally saying something that seemed to be addressed to the objects themselves. Nobody questioned this. Luna's relationship with the extraordinary had always operated by slightly different rules. At one point, 2 hours in, she appeared beside Harry with an object in her hand, a small glass sphere about the size of a large marble, with something moving inside it, light and shadow in a spiral pattern. You should have this one today, she said, pressing it into his palm. It's been very impatient. Harry looked at it. The light inside moved faster when he held it. What does it do? It shows you what things are made of, Luna said. The real kind of made. Not atoms. Magic construction. It let me see the vault's foundation wards just now and they're very beautiful. She went back to the reliquary section. You'll want it when you talk to Dumbledore. Harry pocketed the sphere without argument. By the time they came back up to the surface, through the cart levels, up the sloping corridor, through the main hall that was now busy with mid-afternoon traffic, Harry had 3 full bags and 2 smaller packs, all loaded between the 4 of them, containing between them, a seneschal ring and 3 books from Slytherin, an ancient focus and a bronze disc and a wooden box and 27 working papers from the Emery's vault, and from the Pendragon vault a sword in a scabbard that had materialized around it the moment Harry moved to carry it, 6 warding objects, a compass device, for written records of Pendragon governance in old court hand that Hermione had pulled and pressed to her chest with both hands, and a glass sphere that showed you what things were made of. They emerged onto the marble steps into the bright afternoon Diagon Alley sunlight. "I need food," Neville said. "I haven't eaten since 6 and I've just found out my family owes a blood oath to my best friend, which is a lot to process on an empty stomach." "The leaky cauldron," Harry said. "And then we talk about what comes next." Tom the barkeeper gave them a booth in the back corner, the one with good sight lines and poor visibility from the main room, which was either his version of hospitality toward Harry Potter specifically or just chance, and Harry chose to be grateful either way. Food arrived, proper food, the kind that arrives on big plates and doesn't require finesse to eat, and for a few minutes the 4 of them just ate, which was necessary, and looked at each other with the slightly stunned quality of a group that had spent a day looking directly at things which entirely changed the shape of everything they'd previously understood. Then Hermione straightened up and said, "What's the plan?" Harry had been thinking about this for an hour. 3 stages, he said. "In this order. First, we work through what we have, the transcripts, the texts, the theory. I need to understand what I'm actually capable of before I make any moves. That's 2 weeks, maybe 3. He looked at Neville. "You're going to need to talk to your grandmother." Neville nodded. He'd been quiet on the cart ride back, but his expression had the resolute quality that had been developing in him all day. "She'll want to know. And she'll know things we don't. The Longbottom family histories go back to Arthur's time." "Exactly. Find out what she knows and what she's willing to share." Harry turned to Luna. "The Quibbler. Your father's been printing things for years that the magical establishment dismisses as fantasy. How much of what he prints is actually sourced?" Luna smiled. "Nearly all of it. He changes the names to protect people, and he presents the stories in ways that make them look like speculation, because that's the only way the Ministry doesn't shut him down. But the underlying information is real." She tilted her head. "He has sources in several places you'd find useful. He's been quietly documenting things about old magical families and historical cover-ups for 20 years. Can I meet him?" "He'd be delighted." Harry looked at Hermione. "The second stage. The Wisengamot. I want to make my claim formally, in public, before the full body. Not as a request. As a notification." Hermione had clearly been waiting for this. "You'll need the full inheritance documentation from Gringotts, which Ragnarok said would be ready by Saturday. You'll need to be able to cite the historical precedents for the claim, which I can research. The records in the Pendragon vault are going to be invaluable for that. You'll also need to choose the right moment, because the political impact is going to be enormous," Harry said. "I know. I want it to be. The Ministry will fight it. Fudge will panic. Umbridge will do something terrible." Hermione's expression was the one she got when she was excited and trying not to look excited. "It's going to create an absolute storm." "Good," Harry said. "A storm is useful. It shakes things loose." He picked up his butterbeer. "The 3rd stage depends on what Voldemort does when he hears about stage 2. And he will hear. There's no way to make that kind of claim quietly, and honestly I don't want to. I want him to know." He looked around the table. "He spent his life pretending to be something he isn't. The moment I announce what I am, the foundation of his mythology cracks. He can't be Slytherin's heir if Slytherin's heir is someone else. He can't be the master of the magical world's most ancient power if that power is sitting in someone else's vault." He set his butterbeer down. He'll make a mistake. Powerful people who've never genuinely been challenged always make a mistake when they are. The table was quiet for a moment. You said 3 stages, Neville said. What's the 3rd stage? I deal with whatever mistake he makes, Harry said simply. Another silence. I want to go on record, Hermione said, as being supportive of this plan while also being fully prepared to tell you when it needs adjusting. Noted. I have one addition, Luna said. She was turning her butterbeer glass gently in her hands, her eyes distant in the way that meant she was seeing something the rest of them weren't. There's a 4th thing, before all 3 of those stages. One day, on your own. Not planning, not reading. You need to go somewhere very old and very quiet and let all of what you now know settle into you properly. She looked at Harry. Not because you need permission from yourself to be what you are. But because you've been carrying it since birth without knowing it, and there's a difference between knowing a thing in your head and knowing it in your whole body. You need to make that transition before you walk into the Wizengamot. Harry looked at her. Luna, with her radish earrings and her upside-down quibbler and her conversations with inanimate objects, who had always known precisely what she was talking about even when nobody else understood it. Where? He said. I'll tell you tomorrow, Luna said. Somewhere the old magic is still clear in the ground. There are several in Britain. One of them is quite close. Harry nodded. Tomorrow, then. Outside the leaky cauldron windows, Diagon Alley was moving through its evening rhythms, ordinary and busy, witches and wizards going about their lives with the comfortable assumption that the world was more or less what it appeared to be. In a booth at the back of the cauldron, 4 15-year-olds ate their dinner and planned what came next, and none of them looked particularly dramatic about it, which was perhaps the most dramatic thing of all. Harry reached into his pocket and turned the glass sphere over in his fingers. Through its surface, the light inside moved in its patient spiral, seeing things as they actually were. He was beginning to think he knew exactly how it felt. Chapter 3, The boy who wasn't the place Luna took him was a hill. Not a dramatic hill, not the kind that showed up in paintings of ancient Britain, brooding and significant against a stormy sky. Just a long, gradual rise in the Wiltshire countryside, green and unremarkable from the road, the kind of hill that made walkers pause to catch their breath and then carry on without remembering it particularly. There was a single oak tree at the summit, old enough that its trunk had gone grey and deeply furrowed, its canopy spread wide in the windless morning. They'd taken the night bus at 6, which had deposited them at a B-road junction with what the driver cheerfully described as near enough, and walked the rest through dewy fields. Luna had a hand-drawn map from her father. She followed it with the calm certainty of someone who had been here before, or who simply didn't entertain the possibility of being lost. Harry had his focus rod in his jacket pocket. He'd had it there since the Emery's vault and he'd started to notice it, the warmth of it, the slight attunement quality, the way his own magic seemed to run a little more cleanly when it was near. Like a string that had been slightly slack being brought to proper tension. They reached the summit at 7:30. The oak tree was larger up close, its roots surfacing above the ground in thick, muscular curves, and the view from the top was the particular English countryside view that looked like nothing and somehow contained everything, rolling fields, a village spire, a line of silver where a river ran through the low ground. Sit with your back to the tree, Luna said. Harry sat. Luna sat cross-legged about 4 feet away, facing him, and pulled her knees up and settled her hands in her lap with the ease of someone who did this regularly. Just be here, she said. Don't try to do anything. Don't think about the plan or the vaults or the Wizengamot. Just let the ground be old under you and let your magic do what it does when nobody's asking it to perform. Harry opened his mouth. Shoo, Luna said pleasantly. He closed his mouth. He sat. The first 10 minutes were actively uncomfortable in the way that stillness is always uncomfortable for someone who has spent their entire life in reactive motion, always responding to the next thing, always managing the next crisis, the next Dursley, the next teacher, the next dark wizard. His mind ran through the Merlin transcripts, the Pendragon records, the Wizengamot plan, Dumbledore's face when he found out, Voldemort's, Luna said, without opening her eyes, the hill has been here for about 4,000 years. It can wait for you. Harry exhaled. He let the catalogue run down. It took another 10 minutes, but it ran down. And when it did, what was underneath it was not the blank emptiness he'd half expected, the absence of thought, the meditative nothing that people described when they talked about stillness. What was underneath it was something active and alive and entirely his own, a deep hum that he recognized, in the same way he'd recognized the focus rod, as the thing that had always been there. The thing running beneath every spell he'd ever cast, beneath the Parseltongue, beneath the moments in extreme situations when his magic had moved faster and more decisively than his training should have allowed. The ground under the oak tree was old. Luna had been right about that. He could feel it, not metaphorically but literally, a quality of depth, as if the earth here ran much further down than the physical rock and soil accounted for. Like standing at the edge of a very deep lake and feeling the cold of it on your skin even before you touched the water. His magic moved toward it the way water moves toward a lower point. He sat under the oak tree for 40 minutes, and nobody needed anything from him, and he didn't fight anything or manage anything or protect anyone, and by the time Luna said quietly, "That's enough, I think," he felt different in a way he couldn't have described precisely, but that had something to do with the difference between carrying a thing and being a thing. On the walk back down the hill, he cast a non-verbal lumos without thinking about it, just lit his wand as they walked into the shadow of a hedgerow, and the light that came from it was different. Not more powerful, exactly. More clear. Like the difference between a lamp with a dirty glass and the same lamp with a clean one. Luna looked at his wand and said, "There it is." "What is?" "You," she said. "Properly." He didn't have a response to that. He put his wand away. Hermione's owl found him at the B&B they'd used as a base, a small place that catered mostly to Muggle hikers, where the landlady made an extraordinary amount of porridge and asked no questions, with a letter that said, "Come back. I've found something in the Pendragon records and you need to see it before we do anything else. Also Neville's grandmother wants a meeting. Also there was an owl from Dumbledore this morning addressed to me, which means he knows I'm with you and he's escalating. Also come back now." Harry ate the porridge. It was, in fact, extraordinary. They were back in London by noon. Hermione had taken over the largest table in the back room of the Leaky Cauldron with the systematic thoroughness of a military commander establishing a command post. The Pendragon records she'd pulled from the vault were spread across half the table in careful stacks, with her own notes, several feet of parchment, covered in her smallest handwriting, cross-referenced with colored ink, running alongside them. Neville sat at the other end of the table with a letter in his hand and the expression of someone who had received news that confirmed their worst suspicions while simultaneously making them feel better about them. "Gran wants to meet tonight," he said when Harry sat down. She was expecting the owl. She said, and this is her exact wording, "I wondered when this day would come. I have been prepared for some time." "Of course she has," Harry said. "Where?" "Longbottom Manor. She says it's warded against Floo surveillance and the grounds are clean." Neville paused. "She also said to tell you that the Longbottom family's formal position on the oath is one of honor and welcome, which is her way of saying she's not frightened or resentful about it. Gran doesn't use the word welcome lightly." Harry nodded. "Tonight, then. What did you find?" This to Hermione, who had the alert, slightly tightly wound energy of someone who had been waiting to deliver information for several hours. Hermione put down her quill. "The fealty oaths," she said. "I found the original documentation, not just the list of families but the actual oath texts and the ceremonial records. Harry, there are 37 ancient and noble house seats on the Wizengamot." She looked at him steadily. 29 of them traced directly back to families that swore primary fealty to the Pendragon line. He'd known the number was significant. He hadn't known it was that significant. 29 out of 37, he said. And of the remaining 8, for are houses that were established after the Pendragon era but still have historical alliance records. which leaves 4 genuinely independent seats. She tapped the parchment in front of her. The political implication is that when you walk into the Wisingamot, the majority of the body is already, at a blood oath level, bound to recognize your claim. They may not know it. They may fight it intellectually. But the oath pull will be there. Like what Neville felt, Harry said. Like what anyone in those houses has probably been feeling since Tuesday morning. She paused. Which explains the ministry inquiry to Gringotts. Someone in one of those families felt the oath activate and panicked. Harry leaned back. Who controls those families right now politically? Mixed. Some are pro-Dumbledore, some have been backing Fudge, several are in the Death Eater camp or Death Eater adjacent. But here's the thing, she picked up a specific page. The oath doesn't care about their current political alignment. The oath is to the bloodline. The original wording is specific: I swear my house and my blood to the High House of Pendragon, in sovereignty and in service, until the line ends or releases us. The line has not ended. It has confirmed. And you have not released anyone. I'm not going to, Harry said. Not yet. Hermione looked at him with her careful, reading look. You're going to use it. I'm going to let it be what it is. There's a difference between using leverage and simply not hiding it. He looked at the record spread across the table. What about the Malfoys? Hermione's expression shifted slightly. That's the interesting one. The Malfoy family oath is one of the oldest in the records. It dates back to before the Norman conquest, actually, a French line that relocated and swore fealty to the Pendragon king then sitting. The Malfoy oath is one of the 7 primary fealty oaths. She met his eyes. Draco Malfoy woke up on Tuesday morning with one of the 7 strongest oath pulls in the entire wizarding world, telling his blood to recognize you. The Leaky Cauldron's back room was quiet except for the distant sound of lunch service in the main bar. Harry turned a quill over between his fingers and thought about Draco Malfoy, who was, by any reasonable measure, his enemy, who had sneered at him on their first train ride, who had called Hermione a slur for 4 years, who had spent his entire Hogwarts career positioned on the opposite side of every line Harry stood on. Whose blood was apparently having a completely different opinion. That's going to be an uncomfortable conversation, Harry said. That, Hermione said, is a historic understatement. Luna was at the far end of the table, apparently reading the inventory list from the Emery's vault transcripts with one leg tucked under her, and she said without looking up, he'll come to you. You won't have to find him. The oath pull for a primary fealty house is strong enough to be physically uncomfortable if resisted, and Draco Malfoy is not. She paused, selecting her words. He is not someone with a high tolerance for unexplained physical discomfort that he can't control. She turned a page. He'll find a reason to seek you out within a week. Harry filed that away. What else? Dumbledore's owl, Hermione said. He wants to meet. He's framing it as a welfare check, very concerned, very gentle. You've been away from your safe location, he just wants to make sure everything is all right. She paused. But there's a line at the end that's doing a lot of work. He says, I understand you may have come across some information recently that seems significant. I would very much like the opportunity to provide context. Context, Harry repeated. Yes. He knows exactly what I found. Harry was quiet for a moment. He's been sitting on this for years. Or at least on some of it. Cale said he knew about the Pendragon Regent situation. He stood up. I'll meet him. But on my terms, in my time, and after I've talked to Augusta Longbottom. Hermione nodded once, decisively, in the manner of someone marking a decision recorded. Longbottom Manor was in Derbyshire, a solid Jacobean building at the end of a long beach-line drive, with the particular quality of a house that had been continuously inhabited by the same family for 4 centuries, not ostentatious but deeply, seriously present, every stone of it weighted with continuity. The grounds were immaculate in the slightly severe style of someone who viewed a garden as a project requiring constant authority. Augusta Longbottom met them in the front hall. She was formidable, Harry had always known that. You could see it in the set of her jaw and the way she stood, as if the floor were doing the courtesy of holding her up rather than the other way around. She was wearing dark green robes without the vulture hat, which felt like a concession, not to casualness, but to the seriousness of the occasion. She looked at Harry for a long moment with sharp, intelligent eyes that were Neville's eyes, the same grey, the same directness, without any of the diffidence Neville had learned and was currently losing. "Mr. Potter," she said. "Sit down." They sat. She sat. Tea arrived from somewhere, produced by a house elf with the efficient invisibility of long-established domestic magic. "You should know," Augusta said, pouring without ceremony, "that I have known the Longbottom family oath record since I was 16, when my mother-in-law sat me down the week after my engagement to Franklin and explained that there were obligations attached to the name that went beyond social convention." She set the teapot down. "I have been waiting for either the Pendragon line to be confirmed extinct, at which point the oath would dissolve, or for a confirmation of a living heir. I had begun, in the last decade, to lean toward the former." She looked at Harry. "I was clearly wrong." "Neville felt the oath pull on Tuesday," Harry said. "As did I. And as did every adult member of the Longbottom family with sufficient magical sensitivity, which in our case is 7 individuals." She was direct without being cold. "3 of them have already owed me demanding to know what they felt. I have told them to wait." She looked at Neville, briefly, with an expression that was layered in ways Harry couldn't fully read, apology, perhaps, and something that might have been guilt. "I should have told you the family history earlier, Neville." Neville met his grandmother's gaze with a steadiness that was new, or not new, Harry thought, but finally visible. "Yes," he said. "You should have." Augusta accepted this. "You're correct. I was protective of a future that might never come." A pause. "We are speaking plainly tonight, so I will say plainly, I spent 11 years believing your parents' fate had destroyed our family's relevance to the larger magical world. The oath felt like an inheritance of obligation with no beneficiary. I chose not to burden you with it." She turned back to Harry. "I am choosing differently now. What do you know about the Pendragon records that isn't in the historical documentation?" Harry asked. Augusta's eyes sharpened, the look of someone glad to be asked the right question. She reached into the sleeve of her robes and produced a small, leather-bound book, old enough that the cover had gone silky from handling. "The Longbottom family journal," she said. "Maintained continuously since Edmund Longbottom served on the Pendragon Council in 537. Every generation has added their account of the family's relationship to the High House." She set it on the table between them with deliberate care. "There are things in here about the original oath ceremony, the structure of the Pendragon magical sovereignty, and about Camlin, the real Camlin, not the legend, that are not in any public record." Harry looked at the journal. Then he looked at Augusta. "May I read it?" She considered him for a long moment. Not hesitating, evaluating. Doing the thing that powerful, experienced people did when they were deciding whether the person in front of them was the real thing or a performance of it. "Yes," she said. "You may read it. I would ask that you read it here, tonight, rather than taking it from the house. It has been in this room for 483 years. Harry picked it up. "Then I'll read it here." Augusta looked at Neville again. "You should read it too. You've been overdue for a very long time." Something crossed Neville's face, not quite relief, but the expression of someone who has been waiting for permission they shouldn't have needed but are grateful to finally receive. He nodded. Harry opened the journal to the first page and read, while the fire in the Longbottom Manor sitting room threw steady light across the old ink and the house settled around them with the weight of all its accumulated years. They were there until past midnight. The journal was extraordinary, not just as a historical document but as a record of continuous witness. The Longbottom who had served Arthur Pendragon described the king not as legend but as a specific person, pragmatic, occasionally sharp-tempered, with a particular gift for making people feel that what they were doing mattered because he genuinely believed it did. The oath ceremony was described in detail that made clear it was not a coerced submission but a mutual compact, the Pendragon king swearing in return to the council families, to protect their holdings, to hear their counsel, to exercise sovereignty only in ways that served the magical world's genuine interests. Harry read that section twice. The Camlin record was the one that hit hardest. The real battle had not been the romantic catastrophe of legend, it had been a political assassination, a coordinated strike against the Pendragon line by a coalition of families who had decided they wanted the power of the council without the constraint of a sovereign. The line had not died at Camlin. Arthur's infant grandson had been spirited away by 3 loyal families, including the Longbottoms, and raised in the Muggle world, his magical heritage suppressed so completely that within 2 generations the family was genuinely Muggle, with no knowledge of what they carried. The dormant gene. Resurfacing generations later. Finding its way into the Evans family, into Lily, into Harry. It wasn't an accident, he thought. It was survival. The families that orchestrated Camlin, he said to Augusta, around 10 o'clock, looking up from the journal. Where are they now? Augusta's expression was precise. 3 of them are extinct. One of them merged with another family line through marriage in the 16th century. She paused. And one of them is currently represented on the Wisingamot by its eldest descendant, who is also the current senior undersecretary to the Minister of Magic. Harry looked at her. The Umbridge family, Augusta said, was formerly the House of Umbridon. They changed their name in 1741. Her mouth was thin. I have wondered, sometimes, whether she knows. Walking back through the manor's entrance hall at 12:30, Harry stopped in front of an old portrait on the wall, a formal painting, a man in ancient robes, his face stern and certain, a detail of a standard in the background with a device Harry recognized from the Pendragon vault records. Who is that? He asked. Edmund Longbottom, Augusta said, from behind him. The first. The one who swore. Harry looked at the portrait. Edmund looked back with the painted stillness of very old magical portraits that had been still so long the subject had settled into something between dormancy and genuine sleep. Then, and this was not something Harry had expected, not something that was particularly common in portraits whose subjects had been dormant for centuries, Edmund's eyes moved. They moved to Harry's face. Focused. And then, with the slow deliberateness of something waking from a very long sleep, Edmund Longbottom bowed his head. Not a deep bow. The bow of one equal acknowledging another. Neville made a sound. Augusta said nothing, but her hand moved to her throat in the gesture of someone containing strong feeling. Harry looked at the portrait for a moment. Then he inclined his head in return, the way the transcript of the Pendragon court protocols had described, the sovereign's acknowledgement of a council member, head inclined rather than bowed, the specific gesture of I see you and I count you. Good night, Edmund, Harry said. The portrait's eyes settled closed again. The entrance hall was very quiet. Right, Harry said, turning to Neville. Let's go. He met Dumbledore on a Thursday morning. He chose the location himself, which was the first thing. Not the leaky cauldron, not Hogwarts, not anywhere associated with the Order or with Dumbledore's institutional authority. He chose a small cafe in Muggle London, the kind with mismatched chairs and an industrial coffee machine and absolutely no significance whatsoever, which was precisely the point. Neutral ground that was neutral because it had never been anyone's ground to begin with. He arrived early. He sat facing the door. He ordered a coffee he didn't particularly want and read the Merlin transcript section on what Merlin called political architecture, the structure of how magical power actually organized itself, as opposed to how it claimed to organize itself, until Dumbledore walked in. He looked old. Harry had always thought of Dumbledore as ageless, ancient in the way that mountains were ancient, beyond the reach of normal measurement. Today, walking through the door of a Muggle cafe in plain robes that he'd modified to look like an ordinary overcoat, he looked like a very old man. The weight of what he was carrying showed in the set of his shoulders in a way that his usual spaces, the headmaster's office with all its spinning instruments, the high seat at the top table in the great hall, somehow concealed. He saw Harry. He came to the table and sat down across from him without preamble. "You look well," Dumbledore said. "I am well," Harry said. The coffee arrived. Dumbledore ordered tea, which the waitress delivered with the mild confusion of someone serving a man who looked like a folk singer's conception of Gandalf. "Gringotts," Dumbledore said, when the waitress was gone. "Yes. The blood inheritance ritual." He wrapped both hands around his teacup. The hands were steady. "I had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that you would come to me first." "With respect," Harry said, "you've had 4 years to tell me what you knew. I didn't go around you because I was being reckless. I went around you because I was following a thread you deliberately left untouched." Dumbledore was quiet. This was notable. Dumbledore was almost never quiet when he could be speaking, and the absence of his usual gentle verbal navigation felt significant. "What do you know?" Harry said. "Specifically. I'm not asking for the version where you tell me what you think I need to hear. I want what you actually know." Another pause. "Then, I have known since your birth that the Evans line carried a dormant heritage that was not Muggle-born in the standard sense. Your grandfather on your mother's side was a squib from a family that had lost its magic in the 18th century. The Emrys connection," he paused. "I identified the Emrys line when I examined your mother's magical signature before her graduation from Hogwarts. It was unmistakable to anyone with sufficient knowledge of what to look for." "And the Pendragon connection?" A longer pause. "I became aware of the Pendragon convergence after your first year at Hogwarts. The events in the chamber, your confrontation with Quirrell, produced a magical output that was not consistent with a first-year student, not even an exceptionally talented one. I commissioned a private analysis." He met Harry's eyes. "The analysis suggested that your full inheritance, if it was what I believed it to be, would represent a convergence with no historical precedent." "So you knew," Harry said. "Not accusatory. Factual. I knew the outlines." Dumbledore's voice was careful. "I did not know the full picture. I had not pursued the full picture, because," he stopped. "Because a 15-year-old king is harder to manage than a chosen one," Harry said. The cafe's background noise, the coffee machine, the low conversation at other tables, a radio playing something tinny, filled the silence between them. Dumbledore looked at him, and what was in the look was not the gentle, slightly distant wisdom of the headmaster performing wisdom. It was something rawer than that. Genuine. "Yes," he said. "Because a young man with that kind of heritage and no knowledge of it can be guided. A young man with full knowledge of what he is cannot be guided in the same way. And he set his cup down. "I have been afraid, Harry, of what an unshaped version of your power might look like." "And a shaped version was Cedric Diggory dead in a graveyard," Harry said, and his voice was still level, still factual, but the weight of the name landed in the table between them like something physical. Dumbledore absorbed it. He didn't flinch from it and he didn't try to qualify it. "Yes," he said again. "And a shaped version was that." Harry picked up his coffee. "I'm not angry with you," he said, which was true in the specific way that things are true when you've had time to process them fully. "I understand why you made the choices you made. I understand the logic of the greater good as a framework." He looked at Dumbledore across the table. "But I'm not going to operate inside that framework anymore. I'm going to do what I've been doing for 3 days, which is working with what I actually have, and I'm going to claim my inheritance formally, and I'm going to do all of this on my terms." "I would not expect otherwise," Dumbledore said. And something in his tone had changed, had moved from the careful navigation of a conversation he'd been managing towards something more open. Less performance. "I would ask, I do not demand, and I understand I am not in a position to demand, that you allow me to be useful." "You know things I don't," Harry said. "A great many things." "Then be useful." Harry set his cup down. But as yourself, not as my handler. If you have information that's relevant, give it to me straight, not wrapped in lessons about what I'm ready to hear. He held Dumbledore's gaze. Can you do that? The old man looked at him for a long moment. Whatever he was looking for, apparently he found it. I believe I can, he said. I believe it will be one of the more difficult things I've done, given the habits of a lifetime. But yes. Good. Harry pulled the Merlin transcript from his bag, the section on political architecture, and laid it on the table between them. Then start with this. Tell me what you know about the Pendragon Council structure that isn't in the records. Dumbledore looked at the transcript. Then at Harry. Then he picked up his teacup, settled back in the mismatched cafe chair, and began to talk, not the headmaster's voice, not the gentle guiding voice, but the voice of a man who had spent 150 years actually learning things and was now, for possibly the first time in Harry Potter's life, simply sharing them. Harry listened, and took notes, and asked questions, and the morning ran on around them while the shape of the coming war changed in a small cafe in Muggle London, over bad coffee and adequate tea. Friday arrived with an owl from Ragnarok confirming the full inventory was complete and the documentation ready. Saturday arrived with the full Gringotts inheritance packet, sealed, official, witnessed, with Ragnarok's personal seal on the outer casing, and with it a note that said, the magical community will feel the official registration of this inheritance within 24 hours of your claim. Be prepared for immediate response. We will stand as witness if required. Harry read the note and then spent Saturday afternoon in the Leaky Cauldron's back room with his 3 companions working through their preparation with the focused efficiency that had replaced the initial wonder of the first 2 days. The wonder was still there, underneath, but it had been metabolized into something more useful, a quality of readiness, a preparation of both knowledge and nerve. It was Saturday evening, working through the Pendragon governance records, that Hermione looked up suddenly with the expression of someone remembering something they should have checked 3 days ago. The Horcruxes, she said. The room went slightly still. If you're genuinely Slytherin's heir, Hermione said carefully, and Voldemort made his Horcruxes using Slytherin's locket, Slytherin's power, Slytherin's mythology as the foundation, and if the scar is what we think it is, a piece of his soul that attached to you because of the blood curse, she was working through it in real time, following the logic at speed. The Slytherin inheritance passing to you, the ring, the vault, Kale, does any of that affect the Horcrux connection? Harry looked at his right hand, where the Slytherin ring sat. He'd been wearing it for 3 days and Kale had been a quiet but constant presence, occasionally noting something relevant when Harry was working through a problem, occasionally simply attentive. That is a correct instinct, Kale said. The soul fragment attached to your scar is connected to Riddle's blood connection to the Slytherin line. Now that the primary inheritance has formally passed to you, the fragment's foundation is, unstable is perhaps the word. Harry said this aloud. Hermione stared at him. Unstable how? It is no longer anchored to the Slytherin bloodline because that bloodline now runs to you, not to Riddle. The fragment knows this. It is, confused. If you were to perform a targeted blood magic working directed at the scar, you might be able to accelerate its instability. Can it be removed? Harry asked. The fragment. It can be removed. It requires the same category of magic that created it, deep working, blood layer. Merlin's theory section covers the foundation principles. Your witch with the large books, a beat that felt like assessment. She has the intellect for it, if you give her the right sources. Harry looked at Hermione. Kale says you can work out the extraction method if I give you the right theoretical foundation. Hermione's expression was the one she wore when she was presented with a problem she was very sure she could solve but understood would require absolute precision. The expression of a surgeon, essentially. Tell Kale I'll need everything on deep blood layer working from the Emery sources. She was already picking up her quill. And that I will not attempt a working I'm not completely certain of. Tell her, Kale said, with the dry quality of a consciousness that had been watching humans for 1,000 years, that Salazar would have liked her very much. Damning with faint praise was his highest form of compliment. Harry relayed this. Hermione looked both pleased and mildly alarmed, which was honestly an accurate response. Right, Neville said, from his end of the table, where he'd been reading the Longbottom journal that Augusta had entrusted to Harry with the instruction it was for all of them. Before we get into soul fragments, which is a conversation I need a moment to prepare for, there's something in here about the Pendragon claiming ritual. He set the journal down and slid it across. The formal claim before the Wizengamot, it's not just a declaration. There's a specific form it takes. It requires the 3 tokens of sovereignty. Harry took the journal. Read the passage Neville had marked. The 3 tokens of sovereignty were, the primary weapon of the Pendragon line, which he had, in the form of the sword currently in its scabbard against the wall. A seal object, typically a ring, bearing the blood-confirmed mark of the heir, which he had in the form of the Slytherin ring, which was, per the Pendragon records, the specific seal object of the Pendragon-Slytherin convergence because Salazar Slytherin had been, in his time, the Pendragon king's principal court advisor. And the focus of the Emrys line, which he had in the form of the blackthorn rod currently in his jacket pocket, which had warmed against his ribs steadily since the Emrys vault. He'd had all 3 since Wednesday. He simply hadn't known they were the 3 tokens. I have everything I need, Harry said. The claim can happen whenever we're ready. The table was quiet for a moment, with the quality of 4 people on the edge of something they know will be irreversible. Monday, Hermione said. The Wizengamot sits on Monday for its regular session. If we act now, Ragnarok can have the documentation pre-filed with the Wizengamot clerks before the session opens. They'll be required to enter it into the official record, which means Fudge can't suppress it. Monday, Harry agreed. Luna looked up from the Emrys inventory list, which she'd been cross-referencing with a diagram she'd drawn in her own notebook that appeared to map the theoretical connections between the 3 bloodlines in a way that Hermione had looked at twice and gone very quiet about. He'll know before Monday, Luna said. Tom Riddle. He'll feel the formal registration the same way the Oath families felt the blood confirmation. She looked at Harry. When the claim is registered officially, it won't just tell the wizarding world. It'll tell his magic exactly what it's up against. Good, Harry said. He won't wait for the Wizengamot session. He'll move first, if he can. He can try, Harry said simply, and his voice was the same level it had been for 5 days, the compass needle, the bedrock, the clarity underneath everything. Let him. The candles in the leaky cauldron's back room threw steady, warm light across the table and the books and the 4 of them, and outside, the magical world went about its Saturday evening business, not knowing yet that what was coming was already in motion. Harry touched the rod in his pocket, once, lightly. The wood was warm. You're ready, Cale said. Harry didn't answer. He didn't need to. Chapter 4, Sovereignty. The Wizengamot sat in a circular chamber beneath the Ministry of Magic that had not been redecorated since 1847, which was either institutional pride or institutional inertia depending on who you asked. Dark wood paneling, tiered seating arranged in a horseshoe around a central floor, the kind of lighting that made everyone look slightly more serious than they were. The gallery above the main chamber was technically public, which was the detail Harry had built his entire plan around. He'd never been in the chamber for anything other than his own disciplinary hearing. That had been a defensive action, him, alone, against an institution moving in bad faith. He remembered the feeling of walking in and seeing the full Wizengamot assembled for what should have been a simple underage magic inquiry, the deliberate intimidation of the staging, the chair with the chains. Today he was not walking in as a defendant. Ragnarok had filed the documentation at 7 in the morning, 3 hours before the session opened. The Wizengamot clerks, bound by procedural obligation, had been required to enter it into the day's official record. By 8:30, Harry had reliable information, via a source he'd developed over the last 48 hours that was, technically, Cale, who had a remarkable ability to sense the magical signatures of people experiencing strong emotional reactions at significant distances, that at least 4 senior Wizengamot members had read the morning record summary and were having what could generously be described as a difficult time. At 9:45, Harry stood on the Ministry's main entrance level with Hermione on his left and Neville on his right, all three of them in clean robes. Not dress robes, not formal court attire. Clean, good quality everyday robes, worn the way people wear clothes they're not thinking about because they're thinking about something more important. Harry had the sword in its scabbard on his back, the Slytherin ring on his right hand, the focus rod in his inside pocket. The scabbard was charmed to be unobtrusive, visible if you looked for it, but not announcing itself. He wasn't trying to make an entrance. He was trying to make a fact. Luna was already in the public gallery. She'd gone up separately an hour ago and sent a Patronus, a silvery blur that might have been a hare or might have been something with no established animal equivalent, to confirm she was in position. The gallery was, unusually for a standard Monday session, quite full. Word had moved through the magical community the way it always moved when something significant was in the official record, fast, imperfectly, and with sufficient distortion to make everyone want to see for themselves what was actually happening. "Ready?" Hermione said. "Been ready," Harry said. They went in. The security desk in the Ministry atrium was manned by a witch Harry didn't recognize, who looked at his name in the visitor log, looked at his face, looked at his name again, and said nothing at all, which was itself a kind of statement. She handed him a visitor badge that said Harry James Potter, claimant in letters that seemed to have printed themselves, the magic of the badge system recognizing a category it hadn't needed to use in several centuries. The lift down to the courtroom level was mercifully empty. Harry watched the floors count down and ran through the documentation in his mind, not because he'd forgotten any of it, but because the discipline of checking was its own form of readiness. "The chamber will feel the tokens," Cale said. "The moment you enter with the sword, the ring, and the focus, the room's foundational wards will recognize the sovereignty claim. You won't need to announce it. The room will." "Good," Harry said quietly. Hermione glanced at him. He'd explained the Cale dynamic on Thursday and she'd spent roughly 45 minutes asking the ring highly technical questions through Harry as intermediary, which Cale had answered with the particular patience of someone who recognized a genuinely excellent mind and was therefore willing to be thorough. They'd reached an arrangement that Hermione described as intellectually productive and Cale described, privately to Harry, as the most stimulating conversation since Salazar. The lift stopped. The doors opened. The corridor to the courtroom level spread out in front of them, and at the far end of it, the doors to the Wizengamot chamber were open. Two Aurors were flanking the entrance. Harry recognized both of them, not personally, but by sight, the standard courtroom security detail. They looked at the three approaching students with the same expression the security which had used, a double take, followed by a careful neutrality that was itself informative. "The session is restricted to members and scheduled parties," the nearer Auror said. He said it correctly, by the book, with no particular hostility. "I'm a scheduled party," Harry said. "The filing was entered at 7 this morning. Harry James Potter, formal inheritance claim and sovereignty declaration, registered under Gringotts seal." He held out the documentation packet, Ragnar's sealed casing, official witness marks, the blood confirmation certificate. "If you need to check with the clerk, I know who you are," the Auror said. He looked at the packet. He looked at the sword on Harry's back. He stepped aside. "Proceed." They walked through the doors. The chamber was in full session. 50-some witches and wizards in purple Wizengamot robes arranged in their tiered horseshoe seating, several conversations already interrupted by the sound of the doors opening. At the top of the chamber, in the Chief Warlock's raised seat, Dumbledore was already looking at the entrance. He'd clearly been watching for them, which confirmed he'd read the morning record. At the floor level, behind a long desk, 3 court clerks were shuffling papers with the determined focus of people who had been given an unexpected procedural situation and were handling it by doing everything they normally did, only faster. Cornelius Fudge was in the front row of the Wizengamot seating, in his bottle-green bowler hat, and his face when he saw Harry enter the chamber had the particular quality of a man watching something he had decided was impossible continuing to happen anyway. Dolores Umbridge was 2 seats from Fudge. She was wearing pink. She was very still, with the stillness of a predator that has not yet decided how to respond to an unexpected development. Her eyes followed Harry across the chamber floor with the fixed attention of someone trying to determine the precise nature of what they were looking at. Harry walked to the center of the chamber floor and stopped. The room was not quite silent, there was the rustle and murmur of 50 people processing a new situation, but it was close. The gallery above was completely silent. Harry didn't look up to find Luna. He looked around the horseshoe of Wizengamot members with the calm, steady gaze of someone taking stock. He could feel it. He hadn't been sure he would, had expected it to be abstract, conceptual, something to understand rather than experience. But it was there, tangible as warmth, the oath pull radiating from 29 of the seats in this room. Not uniform, some stronger, some barely perceptible, but present, a web of old obligation that had been dormant for centuries and was now taut and alive and running between him and the people in those seats like a current. Several of the 29 were trying to ignore it. He could see them, senior members, powerful figures, people who had spent their entire careers in this chamber believing themselves to be autonomous, sitting with the particular rigidity of someone fighting a physical sensation they hadn't anticipated. 3 of them were not fighting it. 3 of them, in the seats that Hermione had identified as primary fealty houses with strong direct oaths, were sitting with a different quality. Not rigidity. Recognition. The Bones family matriarch. Lord Greengrass. Old Tiberius Ogden, who was supposedly retired and still attended every session. Harry took the documentation packet from inside his robes and laid it on the clerk's desk. The full inheritance documentation from Gringotts, he said, to the nearest clerk. Blood confirmation, vault access record, and formal notice of sovereignty claim. For the official record. The clerk took it with both hands, looked at it, looked at Harry, and began processing it with the careful efficiency of someone extremely aware that they were handling something historically significant and their name was on the record. Fudge stood up. He did it with the bluster of someone who decided that standing up was itself a form of authority, before he'd entirely worked out what he was going to say when he was standing. This is highly irregular. Highly irregular. Mr. Potter, this is a formal session of the Wizengamot, you cannot simply walk in here and, I filed documentation this morning, Harry said. Not rude. Factual. Standard inheritance claim procedure, registered under Gringotts seal, which by the 1739 Magical Succession Act gives the claimant the right to present before the full body at the next scheduled session. He looked at Fudge with the steady, unimpressed attention that Fudge had never received from someone Harry's age and was visibly uncertain how to process. I'm exercising that right. The 1739 Act applies to standard inheritance claims, Umbridge said from her seat, her voice the familiar soft sweetness that Harry had always found more threatening than shouting. The documentation you have filed is not a standard claim. It is, she paused, and something moved behind her eyes. An extraordinary claim requires extraordinary review. The Act specifies no distinction between standard and extraordinary claims, Hermione said, from behind Harry's left shoulder, her voice carrying the tone of someone who has read the relevant legislation in its entirety and is doing the Wizengamot the courtesy of not explaining how thoroughly. The right of presentation applies to any registered Gringotts inheritance filing. The documentation is registered. The right applies. Umbridge looked at Hermione with the expression she reserved for Hermione specifically, a complex layering of dislike, reluctant acknowledgement of precision, and the particular frustration of someone encountering an argument they cannot find a procedural hole in. She said nothing. Dumbledore spoke from his raised seat, and his voice had the quality it always had in this chamber, carrying without effort, pitched to reach the upper gallery with no apparent intention of doing so. The chair recognizes Mr. Potter's right of presentation under the 1739 Act. The documentation has been entered in the official record. He looked at Harry, and his expression was something Harry hadn't seen on Dumbledore before in a public context, not performance, not theater, not the careful presentation of wisdom for an audience. Just a man, old and tired and fully present, looking at a situation he had helped create and was now trying to meet honestly. Please proceed. Harry turned to face the full chamber. The horseshoe of seats, the clerks, the gallery above where he still didn't look because he didn't need to. He reached into his inside pocket and took out the focus rod, Merlin's focus, the blackthorn wood worn smooth and worn. He held it loosely in his left hand. The sword stayed on his back. The ring on his right hand caught the chamber's lamplight and threw a small green flicker across the floor. He didn't perform any of this. He didn't frame it or preamble it or give it the shape of a speech. He just talked, the way he'd told Hermione and Neville and Luna 5 days ago, straight, clear, the way you talk when you know what you're saying is true. My name is Harry James Potter. On the 12th of July, I underwent a full-blood inheritance ritual at Gringotts Bank, conducted under the personal supervision of Senior Director Ragnarok, witnessed by 4 goblin directors. He held up the documentation packet, the clerk raised their copy. The ritual confirmed 3 primary bloodlines. The House of Emrys, the family line of Merlin the architect. The House of Slytherin, the founder's primary line, running through my father's maternal ancestry. He paused, not for drama, just for clarity. And the High House of Pendragon. I am the last living heir of the magical monarchy that governed Britain before the Wizengamot was established. I have blood confirmation, vault access, and the authenticated documentation of all 3 lines. The chamber was now entirely silent. I'm not asking for recognition, Harry said. Recognition isn't something you ask for. It's something that exists in fact, and the Wizengamot is being informed of it because you have a right to that information, and because the official record of this institution should reflect the truth of the matter. He looked around the horseshoe. I am making a formal sovereignty claim under the ancient rights of the Pendragon line. I am notifying this body that the dormant fealty oaths sworn to the High House of Pendragon have activated and are in effect. And I am informing the Minister for Magic that the Chief Warlock position, per the foundational documents of this Wizengamot, functions as a regency role to be held in trust until a confirmed Pendragon heir comes of age. Fudge had gone the color of old wax. I am 15, Harry continued, and therefore not yet of age under wizarding law. I am not claiming the right to govern this body today. I am claiming the right to exist as what I am, openly, and to have that fact entered in the official record. He looked at Fudge. And to ask the Minister for Magic, on the official record, why he spent the last month telling the public that Lord Voldemort had not returned, a fact that everyone in this room who was at the Department of Mysteries 2 months ago knows to be a lie. The silence shattered. It didn't shatter gradually, it went all at once, 50 voices breaking out simultaneously, purple robes shifting, people turning to each other with the specific energy of a room that has been presented with 2 enormous things at once and is trying to process both while processing neither. Fudge was on his feet again, shouting something at the clerks. Umbridge was speaking in a low, rapid voice to the witch beside her. 3 Wizengamot members, the Bones Matriarch, Greengrass, Ogden, were sitting with a stillness that was entirely different from the chaos around them, the stillness of people who had just felt something large settle into place. Dumbledore's hand came down on his gavel once, twice, 3 times, and the chamber came back to a ragged attention. Order, Dumbledore said, and there was nothing in his voice that needed the gavel for enforcement. The gavel was procedural, the voice was actual. The room quieted. The statement has been made and entered in the official record. The Wizengamot will proceed in an orderly fashion. He looked at Fudge. The Minister for Magic may respond. Fudge's response was not, in the technical sense, a response. It was a collection of words in the general shape of a response, covering denial, procedural challenge, and a claim that the Gringotts documentation required independent magical verification, none of which were wrong on their face but all of which had the quality of a man throwing things at a wall to see what stuck. Harry let him finish. Then he said, the documentation carries Ragnarok's personal seal. Ragnarok has served as senior director of the British branch for 63 years and his seal has never been successfully challenged in a wizarding court. He looked at Fudge. If the minister would like to attempt to challenge it, that is his right. He should be aware that Gringotts has indicated they will stand as witness, which means any challenge would require the ministry to enter into direct legal dispute with Gringotts Bank. A pause. I'd be curious to see how that goes. Something moved through the chamber, not laughter exactly, but the suppressed equivalent, the way rooms react when someone makes a point so clearly that even the people it's aimed at can't pretend not to understand it. Umbridge stood up. She moved to the floor of the chamber with the deliberate, precise movements of someone who had prepared for this possibility. She looked at Harry with her wide, pale eyes and smiled the smile that had always made the hair on the back of Harry's neck rise. "Mr. Potter," she said pleasantly, "regardless of the documentation's technical validity, and we will be examining that very carefully, there is a matter of current status that must be addressed." She let a beat fall. "You are, at this moment, subject to a ministry-issued educational decree that restricts your activities during the current academic term. You are also under investigation for unauthorized, Dolores." The voice came from the far side of the Wizengamot horseshoe. Not loud. Not particularly charged. Augusta Longbottom, who had arrived through the member entrance at some point during the last 10 minutes and taken her family's ancient house seat, the Longbottom seat that had sat empty since Frank Longbottom's incapacitation, was looking at Umbridge with an expression like 68 years of extremely well-maintained contempt finding its target. "Sit down," Augusta said. Umbridge stared at her. "I beg your, the ancient house of Longbottom is a primary fealty house to the Pendragon line," Augusta said, at normal volume, the room entirely silent around her. "Our family has held that oath since 537 CE. When I sat down in this seat this morning for the first time in 11 years, it was with the full intention of exercising that obligation." She looked at Harry, briefly, with the expression that Edmund's portrait had used, acknowledgement, equal to equal. Then back to Umbridge. "You are attempting to use a procedural instrument to interrupt a formal sovereignty claim that is recognized under magical law older than the Ministry of Magic. I am formally objecting on behalf of my house and asking you to sit down." Umbridge's smile did not waver, but her eyes shifted, and the shift was informative. She was calculating, measuring, and what she was measuring was how much of the room was with her. She looked around the chamber. She found less than she expected. She sat. Not because she was done. Not because she had conceded anything. But because the calculation had come out wrong and she knew it, and a person like Umbridge always retreated from a losing tactical position to plan a better one, which was what made her more dangerous than a person who simply kept charging. Harry filed that away. Tiberius Ogden stood up. He was 83 and moved with the controlled deliberateness of someone who had chosen to age in a way that maintained function over appearance, and when he spoke it was with the unhurried authority of someone who had been in this chamber for 50 years and had outlasted 6 ministers for magic. "I would like to formally note," Ogden said, "that the Ogden family holds a secondary fealty oath to the House of Pendragon, sworn in the time of Uther, and that upon physical confirmation of oath activation, which I experienced on Tuesday last, it is the obligation of this house to formally recognize the claim." He looked at Harry over the intervening distance with sharp, bright eyes. "I recognize it. Let the record show." The Bones matriarch stood. "The House of Bones recognizes the claim. Let the record show." Greengrass stood. "The House of Greengrass recognizes the claim. Let the record show." 3 more Wizengamot members stood in the next 60 seconds, each one speaking the same formal phrase in the slightly stilted language of people reading from a very old script that they somehow knew despite having never spoken it before, their blood knowing the words even if their minds hadn't. Fudge was watching this with the expression of a man seeing the ground move under his feet. Harry watched him watching it and felt, for the first time in the last hour, something that was not quite emotion but was adjacent to it, the particular quality of a thing that has been building for a long time finally arriving at its destination. Dumbledore brought the gavel down once. "The record will reflect the formal recognitions." His voice was measured, precise, performing the procedural role the chamber required of him while everything else in his manner spoke of a man sitting at the intersection of history and consequence. "The sovereignty claim is entered. This body will convene a formal review session within 30 days to establish the procedural framework for the Pendragon succession under current wizarding law. He looked at Harry. The claimant may withdraw. Harry looked at Dumbledore for a moment. Then around the chamber, at Fudge's wax-colored face, at Umbridge's calculating stillness, at Augusta Longbottom standing straight in her family seat, at the 6 Wisengamot members still on their feet. At the gallery above where he finally, briefly looked and saw Luna sitting in the front row with her notebook open and her expression of serene, interested attention, and beside her, and this was not something he'd planned or expected, a lean, blond boy in non-Hogwarts robes sitting perfectly still with an expression on his face that Harry had never seen on Draco Malfoy before. Not contempt. Not smugness. Not the performance of superiority that Draco had been wearing like a coat since he was 11. Something much more raw than that. Something that, on anyone else, Harry would have called recognition. Their eyes met. Draco looked away first. Harry turned and walked back toward the chamber doors with Hermione and Neville behind him. He didn't rush it. He moved at a pace that said the chamber was large enough to accommodate his exit time without it being a problem. He didn't look back. Behind him, the chamber's controlled silence broke again into noise. Outside in the corridor, the three of them walked 30 feet from the chamber doors before Hermione said, Bones, Greengrass, Ogden, and 3 others. She was already running the numbers. 6 formal recognitions in the room, plus Longbottom. That's 7. Not all the Oath families were represented today, Neville said. Several of the primary houses sent proxies rather than the direct family member. The Oath poll is different through a proxy. They'll be at the review session, Harry said. 30 days. Hermione nodded. Which gives us 30 days to, she stopped. Draco Malfoy was in the gallery. I know. Luna said he'd come to you. I know. Harry looked at the ministry corridor around them, stone and torchlight, the particular underground atmosphere of the ministry's lower levels. He found us faster than a week. What do you want to do about it? Before Harry could answer, footsteps in the corridor behind them. Unhurried. Deliberate. With the particular quality of someone who had decided to do something and was committing to it fully rather than letting themselves slow down into second thoughts. Harry turned. Draco Malfoy stopped 6 feet away. He was in civilian robes, nothing Hogwarts, and he had the look of someone who had gotten very little sleep in the last 5 days. The Malfoy composure was still there, deep habitual, bred into him since infancy, but underneath it something was working very hard in a new direction, visible in the set of his jaw and the particular quality of his eyes, which were doing the same calculation they'd always done but arriving at a completely different answer. I need to talk to you, Draco said. He looked briefly at Hermione and Neville, both of whom were regarding him with the specific reserve of people who had not forgotten 4 years of history but were willing to hold it aside while they saw what happened next. Privately. No, Harry said pleasantly. Draco blinked. I heard what you said. The answer is no. Anything you want to say to me you can say in front of Hermione and Neville, because they're not going anywhere and I'm not asking them to. Harry looked at him steadily. So. What do you need to say? Something moved across Draco's face. The habit of Malfoy entitlement rearing up, the automatic insistence on terms, and then something deeper than habit cutting across it and overriding it, an internal conflict that was visible enough to be almost uncomfortable to watch. The Oath, Draco said finally. His voice was flat. Doing the Malfoy thing of flattening feeling so far down it was inaudible. I've been feeling it since Tuesday. My father said to ignore it. He said it was a mistake, that the Pendragon line was extinct. A pause. My father is wrong. Yes, Harry said. The Malfoy oath goes back to the Norman period. It's one of the 7 primary oaths. Draco said this with the tone of someone reciting information they verified obsessively since Tuesday. Which means what I'm feeling isn't, it won't just go away. My father thinks it'll fade. His eyes met Harry's directly. It's not fading. No, Harry said. It isn't. So. Draco's jaw worked. So I need to understand what it means. Practically. What you're asking. I'm not asking you anything, Harry said. The oath isn't mine to invoke. It's your family's obligation and your choice how to respond to it. I'm not going to pressure you and I'm not going to pretend it doesn't exist. He watched Draco process this. What does it feel like? Draco looked at him with an expression that said this was not the conversation he'd prepared for. Like, standing in a room and knowing which direction north is, he said after a moment. All the time. Without trying. And the north is you. He said the last part with the particular awkwardness of someone who has found the most accurate description for something and dislikes the accuracy. Which is deeply irritating. Hermione made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. Draco's gaze flicked to her and back. What did your mother say about it? Harry asked. It was a specific question, a piece of information he'd wanted since Hermione had identified the Malfoy oath in the records. Something in Draco's face shifted. She said, a pause. She said it meant something real was happening. She said our family had been waiting for something real for a very long time. Harry held that thought for a moment. The Malfoy family owes nothing to Voldemort, Harry said. Whatever arrangement your father made, whatever mark he took, that was his choice, not the House of Malfoy's obligation. The oath your family swore is older than Voldemort by 1,000 years and it runs in a different direction. He looked at Draco. I'm not asking you to switch sides. I'm not asking you to do anything tonight except think clearly about what your family actually owes and to who. Draco stared at him. Doing the calculation that Draco always did, but the variables had changed in ways that his habitual calculation wasn't built for. My father is going to have to figure out where he stands, Harry said. That's his problem. You're not your father. A long silence. The ministry corridor around them was empty except for the three of them and whatever conclusion Draco was working toward in the complicated machinery of his own particular intelligence. I'm not agreeing to anything, Draco said finally. I'm not turning on my family. I'm not asking you to. Then what are you asking? Harry thought about the Pendragon journal, the old Longbottom account of Arthur in council, the king who had asked his advisors to challenge him, who had built the system around honest counsel rather than comfortable agreement. Think, Harry said. Just think, clearly, without your father's voice in your ear. That's all. Draco looked at him for another long moment. Then he straightened, the Malfoy posture, the controlled elegance of it, but carrying something under it now that hadn't been visible before. Fine, he said. And walked away. Harry watched him go. That went better than expected, Neville said. Give it time, Hermione said. He's going to go home and his father is going to say something and he'll have to do the whole thing over again internally. Probably, Harry said. But he'll get there. You sound very certain. Cale says the Malfoy oath is one of the strongest in the records. Physical resistance to it is, he paused, finding Cale's exact phrasing. Actively unpleasant over sustained periods. Neville winced. Poor Draco. Don't oversell it, Hermione said. The magical community felt the official registration of the sovereignty claim at 3:15 that afternoon, which was when the clerk's processing of the Wisengamot documentation pushed it through the institutional record system and into the broader magical registry, and the registry did what it had been designed, in the Pendragon era, to do when a sovereignty claim entered it. Harry was at the Leaky Cauldron when it happened, working through Merlin's section on deep magic theory with Hermione and the Emery's theoretical framework spread across the table. He felt it the way you feel a door open, a shift in the ambient quality of things, brief, significant. Then his scar burned. Not the grinding, nauseating pain of his 4th year or the vision-carrying ache he'd been tracking since Voldemort's return. Something different. Sharp and structural, like a seam under pressure. Cale had said the soul fragment was unstable. This felt like instability confirming itself. He knows, Cale said. Harry put his hand to his scar and breathed through the burn until it settled. Hermione was watching him with her hands flat on the table. Voldemort, Harry said. How? Cale's been monitoring the fragment. The connection goes both ways when he's emotional. Harry removed his hand from his scar. The burn had faded. He's not afraid. That's not what that was. He thought about it, reading the quality of what had come through. He's recalibrating. He knows what I am now. He felt the full inheritance through the scar connection and he paused. Calculating, Cale said. The way Riddle always calculates. He will move against the anchor points. The places where Pendragon sovereignty is embedded in the land itself. Harry looked at Hermione. Do you know what the Pendragon anchor points are? She was already reaching for the Pendragon records she'd pulled from the vault. Historical sites. I read about them in the vault records, the places where the original sovereignty claim was ratified, where the deep magic binding between the king and the land was made formal. She found the page. There are 7 stone circles, old barrows, one of them is a spring. Geographically they form a pattern across Britain. He'll target them to undermine the binding, Harry said. If he destroys them, he'll try to destroy what I am before I've had time to fully consolidate it. Harry stood up. Which anchor point is most vulnerable? Most accessible? Hermione scanned the page. Her fingers stopped. She looked up. Avebury. The stone circle at Avebury in Wiltshire, it's right on the surface, partially in a Muggle village, no concealment wards remaining. She paused. Harry, it's 10 miles from the hill you were on this morning. Of course it was. How long do we have? If he moves fast, she was calculating. He won't send Voldemort himself, not yet. He'll send someone. Death Eaters, probably several. Tonight. Tonight, Harry agreed. He looked at Neville. Can you apparate yet? Passed my test in June, Neville said, with the calm of someone who has been waiting for weeks to be useful and is now ready. Good. Harry was already picking up the sword's scabbard from where it leaned against the wall. We're going to Avebury. We should tell Dumbledore, Hermione said. I'll send a Patronus. Harry buckled the scabbard across his back. He can come if he wants. But I'm not waiting for a strategy meeting. Hermione looked at him. The conflict was visible in her face, the trained instinct that said adults, backup, structure, and the 4 days of watching Harry operate that had been reshaping what she understood about those instincts and when they applied. Okay, she said. She began packing the records with rapid, economical movements. But if we get there and it's 20 Death Eaters, then there are 20 Death Eaters, Harry said. Come on. Luna appeared in the doorway of the back room. She'd been in the main bar, reading, and had apparently known something was shifting before anyone said anything because she already had her bag on her shoulder. Avebury, she said. Harry looked at her. How did you? The Raxperts just all left the room at once, Luna said, as if this were self-explanatory. That always means something's happening at an anchor point. Neville made his resigned sound. Right. Avebury. Harry cast the Patronus, the stag, silver and immediate, shaking its antlers once before he pointed it toward where Dumbledore would be, and they went. Chapter 5, The War Before the War. Avebury at night was not how the tourists saw it. The Muggle village threaded through the ancient stone circle like something that had grown around a forgotten thing, houses and a pub and a car park, human settlement arranged in casual proximity to stones that had been standing since before any institution the magical or Muggle world had built. During the day it was a tourist destination. Historic England signs. A gift shop. People walking dogs. At 11 at night it was empty and it was old, and the oldness of it was a different quality than the oldness Harry had felt in Gringotts or in the Emery's vault. Those were oldnesses preserved protected, maintained by intention. Avebury was old the way weather was old, ongoing, ambient, indifferent to whether anyone was paying attention to it. They'd operate to the road outside the village boundary, Harry pulling Hermione with him, Neville taking Luna, both arrivals within seconds of each other, and moved on foot through the village's quiet lanes toward the main circle. The air had the specific chill of open English countryside after dark, smelling of cut grass and chalk and the approaching edge of something that wasn't quite ozone but was adjacent to it. The something adjacent to ozone got stronger as they reached the outer ditch of the circle. "They're already here," Harry said quietly. He couldn't see them yet. But he could feel it, the way the ambient magic of the site, steady and deep as an underground river, was disturbed. Surface disruption, like stones thrown into still water. Someone working against the grain of what this place was. Cale said. At the northeast quadrant. Working as Severance Ward, they are trying to break the anchor bond from the stone side. They have a ritual cutter, not a wand worker. This will take them approximately 20 more minutes to complete. For Death Eaters, Harry said, for the others. Northeast. 20 minutes before they finish. He looked at the three of them. Hermione, I need you on the ritual. Can you counter a Severance Ward if I give you the stone to work from? If I have the Pendragon Ward structure, she said. The records I brought, you have them? She pulled her bag around and produced a folded sheaf of parchment with the efficiency of someone who had never once, in her life, left important documents behind. I grabbed everything relevant before we left. Good. Find the anchor ward description, what holds the bond in the stone. You're reinforcing it while I deal with the four. He looked at Neville. Perimeter. Watch the other access points. If this is a two-stage operation, there'll be a second team moving when the first one completes. Neville nodded once and moved, circling wide around the edge of the ditch, moving through the darkness with a groundedness that had been building in him all week and now looked entirely natural. Luna was looking at the stones. The northeast quadrant, she said. There's a gap in the standing stones there. The original circle had more stones, most of them have fallen or been moved by now. The gap is where the bond is weakest. She looked at Harry. That's why they chose it. They know the circle's structure. Which means they've done research, Harry said. This isn't improvised. No, Luna agreed. Someone planned this carefully. She paused. I'll come with Hermione. The ward work will go faster with two people and the stones will, they'll let me feel what they need. I'm good with that. Harry looked at her for a second. Luna Lovegood, who talked to stones and probably had excellent reasons for it. Fine. Stay close to her. If anyone gets past me, we'll be fine, Luna said serenely. Harry left them moving toward the northeast quadrant from the south, circling wide to avoid the Death Eater's awareness, and went in direct. He found them about 90 seconds later. Four of them, black robes, masks, arranged in a rough diamond around a section of the ancient ditch where two of the great stones rose from the ground like misshapen teeth. One was working at ground level with what looked like a chisel made of some black material that was not metal, the ritual cutter Cale had mentioned, designed to work against magical stone. The other three were maintaining a triangle ward, wands out, holding the ambient magic of the site at bay while the cutter worked. Harry stood at the edge of their ward and looked at the operation with the analytical attention he'd been developing all week, reading the structure of what they were doing the way Merlin's theory had taught him to read magic, not as individual spells but as a system, the parts and their relationships and the point where the system was most vulnerable. The point was the triangle ward. Break one corner of the triangle and the whole thing came down, the site's natural magic would surge back, and the cutter would lose their footing in the working. He pulled the focus rod from his pocket and rolled it once between his fingers, feeling the attunement quality settle. Then he looked at the three wand workers holding the triangle and did something he hadn't consciously tried before but that the Merlin theory had described clearly enough that he understood the principle. He reached past the surface layer of magic, the spell layer, the incantation and intention layer, and touched the deep layer underneath, the foundation layer that Merlin had described as the language magic spoke to itself. He touched it the way you touch a taut string to produce a note, light and precise, and he said, quietly in Parseltongue, not a spell, just the deep speech, the oldest layer of magical communication, stop. The nearest corner of the triangle ward simply went out. Not broken, not overcome. It stopped, the way a fire stops when you remove its fuel, because the underlying magic it was drawing on had responded to the deep speech and withdrawn its cooperation. The wand worker holding that corner made a strangled sound and stumbled, their working suddenly unsupported, and the triangle ward shuddered and destabilized, and then the other two corners were pulling wrong and the whole structure came down in 2 seconds. The surge of Avebury's natural magic was immediate. The ground seemed to breathe, a vast, low exhalation, the deep magic of a site that had been under temporary suppression releasing itself back into ambient flow. The cutter at the ditch's edge was knocked backward by the shift, their black instrument spinning out of their hand, clattering against one of the standing stones. All 4 of them looked up. Harry was standing 20 feet away, focus rod in his left hand, no wand, illuminated by the faint ambient light of a circle that was now running normally again. He looked at them and said nothing, because the situation was self-evident. The Death Eaters were not amateurs. That was clear from the first half-second. The 2 who recovered their footing fastest came up with spells already moving, Avada, from one and Crucio from another, both aimed with the practiced coordination of people who had been fighting together for years. Harry sidestepped the killing curse, stepped left, in the same way he'd sidestepped obstacles in Quidditch for 4 years, the body sense of it entirely automatic, and deflected the Cruciatus with a simple shield that he pushed down to the foundation layer as he cast it, making it dense rather than wide, absorbing the curse fully rather than deflecting it into the space around them. Then he took a breath and decided to stop being careful. He raised the focus rod and touched the deep layer again, and this time he didn't say stop. He said something older than stop, a word in the deep speech that Merlin had used once in his working papers and described only as the word for unmaking the structure of hostile intention, and the magic that came out of the focus rod was not a spell in any catalogue Harry had ever been taught. It was white. Not the cold white of Avada Kedavra or the sharp white of an Expelliarmus. The warm white of something fundamental, like sunlight run through clean glass, and it moved through the space between Harry and the 2 attacking Death Eaters with a totality that left no corners. Both Death Eaters went down. Not injured. Not damaged. Unconscious, completely and instantly, their wands dropping to the grass, their bodies settling like someone had simply removed the tension from every muscle at once. The deep speech word had not hurt them, it had stopped the hostile intention in their magic the same way a flame stops without fuel, and their bodies, suddenly without the scaffolding of active magical aggression, had simply gone quiet. The cutter scrambled upright and ran. The 4th Death Eater, the one who'd been holding the 3rd corner of the triangle ward, stood absolutely still. They were looking at the 2 people on the ground, and at Harry, and at the focus rod, and making the calculation that anyone with functioning survival instincts would make in that situation. Then they raised their hands, wands out and pointing up, the universal signal of someone who has decided to stop. "Who sent you?" Harry said. Silence. Was it Voldemort directly, or through a lieutenant? He moved forward slowly, not rushing it. "I'll find out either way. It's better for you if you tell me now." The Death Eater's masked face was tilted toward him. Something was working behind the mask. Harry could see it in the angle of the head, the set of the shoulders, the specific quality of stillness that meant thinking rather than submission. "Rookwood," the Death Eater said. Their voice was muffled by the mask but audibly young. Younger than Harry had expected. Augustus Rookwood. He planned this. He said it was a test. To see if the sites could be severed. A test, Harry said. Not the main operation. I don't know what the main operation is. The voice was slightly unsteady now, the shock of the last 2 minutes working through them. I joined 6 weeks ago. They don't tell people like me about the main operations. True, Cale said. Harry looked at this person, young, terrified, wearing a Death Eater mask they'd put on 6 weeks ago in whatever desperate, frightened, or coerced circumstance had led them there, and felt nothing punishing toward them. They were a consequence of a system, not an architect of it. "Take off the mask," Harry said. A pause. Then the mask came off. A girl. 17, maybe 18, dark-haired, with the look of someone from a family that had been in the Death Eater orbit long enough that joining had felt like the path of least resistance rather than an active choice. She looked at Harry with her hand still raised and something on her face that was not defiance or malice but something simpler and harder to look at, someone waiting to find out whether the worst they imagined was about to happen. "What's your name?" Harry asked. "Delphi, Daphne," she corrected immediately, the micro-flinch of someone who'd used a name they shouldn't have. Harry filed the slip away. "Daphne. What family?" She didn't answer. But her eyes moved, involuntarily, to the standing stones around them, and there was something in that movement, a recognition, a familiarity, that suggested she was not a stranger to ancient magical sites. "Go," Harry said. She stared at him. "What?" "Go." He stepped back, out of her path toward the outer ditch and the road beyond. "Leave your wand. Don't come back to this site or any of the others. If you want a different path than the one you're on, find it." He held her gaze. "This is the only time I'll send someone away from an active attack without consequence. I won't do it again." She bent, set her wand on the grass, her hands were shaking, and walked past him toward the ditch. She moved fast, not quite running but with the controlled urgency of someone trying to get clear before the offer expired. She cleared the ditch and Harry heard her footsteps quicken on the road and then heard nothing. He turned and looked at the 2 unconscious Death Eaters on the grass. 2 wands had been dropped, plus Daphne's. He picked up all 3, pocketed them, and cast binding charms on the 2 unconscious figures, competent, standard charms, nothing punitive. Then he sent a Patronus to the Aura department, with a message that he'd left 2 for collection at the northeast quadrant of Avebury. The stag shook its head at him, there was something always slightly judicious about his Patronus, and disappeared. He turned toward where Hermione and Luna were working. He found them at the base of the largest standing stone in the northeast quadrant, both on their knees in the grass. Hermione had the Pendragon ward record spread in front of her with a lumos floating above them, her wand moving in the careful, microscopic strokes of someone doing surgical magical work. Luna had both palms flat on the base of the stone and her eyes closed and her head tilted with the listening quality she brought to things that most people didn't know how to listen to. "How's it going?" Harry said. "Shoo," Hermione said, without looking up. "I'm reinforcing the 4th anchor matrix." Harry waited. He sat on the grass nearby and took out the bronze disc from his bag, the object he'd taken from the Emery's vault, which Kale had identified as a wayfinding instrument for the Pendragon anchor points, capable of mapping their current status. He held it flat in his palm and focused, the way Merlin's theory described, at the foundation layer. The disk's surface shifted. 7 points, mapped in pale light, the anchor sites of the Pendragon binding across Britain. 5 were steady, the deep magic of them running clean and undisturbed. 1, here, Avebury, had a flicker of instability, the damage from the ritual cutter visible as a tiny irregularity in the light pattern. And 1, Hermione. Still busy. "There's another one being hit right now." She looked up. "Where?" He turned the disc toward her. The 6th point, north of here, had a very different quality from the Avebury disruption. This wasn't a severance working. This was something heavier, more direct, the kind of magical impact that didn't bother with ritual cutting because it intended to simply break the site by force. "What's the 6th site?" Harry asked. Hermione looked at the records with rapid eyes. "Glastonbury." She looked at him. "Harry, Glastonbury Tor, that's not just an anchor point, it's the primary binding. It's where the Pendragon sovereignty claim was originally ratified. If that site is broken, the whole thing unravels," Harry said. She stared at him. They used Avebury as a decoy, she said, the realization arriving in her voice with the flat shock of someone who should have seen it and hadn't. Get us here, deal with a manageable threat, while the real operation goes to Glastonbury, Harry finished. He was already standing. Can you finish here? Nearly done. 5 more minutes. Her hands were already back on the stone, wand moving. Go. Neville, I'll find him. Go. Harry looked at Luna, who had opened her eyes and was looking at him with an expression that was not alarm but was the closest thing to alarm he'd ever seen on her face. How bad is it? He asked her. Bad, Luna said simply. Someone very powerful is there. Harry disapparated. Glastonbury Tor at night was a hill with a tower at its top, a ruined medieval church reduced to a single standing column, visible from miles away against the Somerset sky. The land around it was flat, the Somerset levels, old flood plain, with the Tor rising from it like something that had refused to be submerged. The drive up from the village was a walking path, no cars. Harry arrived at the base of the hill and started up on foot. He felt what was happening before he saw it. The deep magic of the Tor was not the ambient, steady river of Avebury, it was a column, a vertical thing, running straight up through the hill from deep in the earth to the crown at the top where the ruined tower stood. The sovereignty binding of the Pendragon line was concentrated here, at the primary anchor, like a root system coming to a single taproot. Someone was attacking the taproot. The person at the summit of Glastonbury Tor was not 4 Death Eaters working a severance ritual. It was one person, and what they were doing to the primary anchor was not subtle. The magic coming down the hill toward Harry as he climbed was recognizable from 50 yards out, the raw, structural force of someone with extraordinary power and the absolute willingness to use it without restraint. He recognized the magical signature. Bellatrix Lestrange. She was not the field general type. She was the kind of power that Voldemort sent when he wanted something destroyed thoroughly and immediately, the way you'd use a hammer rather than a chisel. Her magic was like that, percussive, overwhelming, built for impact over precision, and she wielded it with the particular joy of someone for whom destruction was its own reward. Harry came over the crest of the Tor and found her standing at the base of the ruined tower, both hands raised, conducting something that was not a standard curse or hex but a full offensive ward-breaking working, the kind that required sustained output and was tearing at the Pendragon anchor with the thoroughness of something designed specifically for this purpose. She turned when she heard him. Even in the dark her eyes caught light in the wrong way. She looked at him with the brightness of someone who had been hoping for exactly this. The little king, Bellatrix said, and her voice was the voice she used when something delighted her. Not mocking. Genuinely pleased, the way a cat is genuinely pleased by a mouse that puts up a fight. He came himself. How very brave. How very stupid. Harry stopped 10 feet from her. He looked at the tower, at the ground around it, at the anchor point. The disc was in his hand and even without looking at it he could feel the Glastonbury binding vibrating with stress, the sustained attack it had been under for however long Bellatrix had been here. Minutes. Maybe more. You'll need to stop that, Harry said. Bellatrix laughed. The sound of it was designed to make people feel cold, and Harry noted the design and set it aside. He came alone. The little king came alone to the most important anchor point in Britain, with one pretty ring and a stick and, she looked at the sword on his back. Is that the Pendragon blade? Something shifted in her face, a deeper interest cutting through the theatrical. He actually has it. She stopped the working. Not because Harry had asked her to. Because the sword had her full attention now, and Bellatrix's attention was the kind that required a single focus. She took a step toward him with the particular quality of someone forgetting, briefly, to be calculating because something shiny had appeared. The Dark Lord wants that sword, she said, her voice softer and more genuine than the theatrical version. He has wanted it since he understood what it means. Pendragon sovereignty can't be claimed by force, you can't take the blade and use it, it doesn't work like that. He knows that. She took another step. But you're 15, and you're alone, and the blade chooses the heir, and if the heir is dead, the binding dies with me, Harry said. And the anchor points would eventually fail without a living sovereign to sustain them. So you understand the logic, she said, sounding almost approving. I understand it, Harry said. I also understand that you've been working on this anchor for, he glanced at the disc. About 20 minutes. Which means it's stressed but not broken. If you're going to kill me and break the anchor in the same operation, you needed more time than you had. He met her eyes. You didn't have more time because someone tipped off your decoy operation to us early, which means Voldemort's information about my schedule was wrong. Which means there's a gap in his intelligence on what I've been doing this week. Something moved across Bellatrix's face. Not uncertainty, she didn't really do uncertainty, but a recalculation. He could see her doing it, the rapid tactical assessment of someone who had walked into a situation she believed she controlled and was now finding the margins of that control were different than she'd thought. You are, she said, entirely too much like him. Like Voldemort? Like the old ones. She was looking at him the way she'd looked at the sword, with the genuine interest that was the most dangerous version of her. The really old ones. The ones the Dark Lord talks about. Her head tilted. He doesn't talk about it often. He doesn't like to. But sometimes, when he's not quite himself, he talks about them. The kings. The real ones. Harry took the sword from its scabbard. It happened in one motion, the blade catching the ambient light of Glastonbury Tor at midnight and doing what it always did, breaking the light into things that weren't quite colors. The transparent blade, the light running through it to places that were further away than the physical space of the hilltop. Bellatrix looked at it with an expression that went through three things in quick succession: hunger, recognition, and something complicated and unhappy. Here is the thing about the logic you described, Harry said. He moved the sword once, settling its weight in his hand, the perfect balance of it, built for the specific proportions of his bloodline, 15 centuries of refinement toward this particular grip. You're right that I'm the anchor. Kill me and the binding fails eventually. That's correct. He looked at her over the blade. But killing me is harder than Voldemort has told you it is. You know that. You were there in the graveyard, you heard what happened when he tried. And he'd just gotten his body back and had a full ritual and 14 months of planning. He was weakened, Bellatrix said, but the certainty had a fault line in it. He was weakened. And I'm stronger now than I was then. Harry kept his voice conversational. Not threatening, just precise. Accurate. You're very powerful, Bellatrix. One of the most powerful combat wizards alive. I'm not dismissing that. But this is not a situation where power is the deciding variable. He gestured with his free hand to the ground around them, the tor, the anchor point, the deep column of sovereignty magic running through the hill. You've been here 20 minutes and you haven't broken it. Because the anchor recognizes what I am and it's been holding against you. If I put my hand on that tower right now, everything you've done in the last 20 minutes will undo itself in about 30 seconds. Bellatrix looked at him. Really looked, the way she rarely bothered to look at anything, with the undeceived attention of someone who had spent 30 years around powerful people and could tell the performance from the reality. You're not bluffing, she said. No. She moved. She was fast, genuinely, terrifyingly fast, the speed of a lifetime of combat, 3 curses fired in the time it took most wizards to think about the first one. Avada Kedavra and Crucio and something Harry didn't have a name for, a dark red working that hit with the intent of structural damage. Harry moved on the deep layer. The first 2 he deflected, the same dense foundation layer shield, pushing the curses into a redirection rather than a collision, letting them spend themselves against the Tor's stone rather than against him. The third he dissolved at the source, the focus rod in his off-hand catching the intent of it and pulling the deep speech word across it the way you'd pull a thread from a weave, and the dark red working came apart 3 feet from him. Then he closed the distance. He was not a duelist in the classical sense, for years of data and his own talent had given him solid technique but not the practiced flourish of a combat specialist. He didn't try to be a duelist. He moved like someone who had been reading Merlin's notes on physical magic engagement for a week and had understood, fundamentally, that the point was not to outduel an opponent but to get past the surface layer of the exchange and touch the foundation underneath. Bellatrix fired again, 3 more, rapid, the combination of someone very good under pressure, and Harry took the hits on the shield and kept moving, and when he was close enough he reached out with the focus rod and placed the tip of it against the stone of the ruined tower. The effect was immediate. The Glastonbury anchor lit up. It wasn't metaphorical and it wasn't subtle, the deep magic of the Tor surged back through the primary binding like water returning to a cleared channel, 20 minutes of Bellatrix's sustained attack undone in exactly the time Harry had estimated, and the light of it came up through the ground and through the stone and through the tower, and it was the same warm white that had come from the focus rod on the hilltop when he dealt with the Death Eaters at Avebury, but this time it was the land itself producing it, the sovereignty binding recognizing the air at the primary anchor and completing a circuit that had been dormant for 15 centuries. Bellatrix Lestrange was 20 feet from him when the light went up and she stopped dead. She stopped dead because the light was doing something to her magic, not hurting her, not attacking her, but the same thing the deep speech word had done to the Death Eater's hostile intention at Avebury, a total withdrawal of cooperation, the foundation layer simply declining to support her spell work in this space, at this moment, with this person present. She could still act. She had her own will and her own substantial native power, and she was not neutralized. But she could feel what had just happened, she could feel the shift in the ground's response to her, and for the first time in the conversation her face showed something that was not calculation or performance or the particular joy of a very powerful person doing something destructive. She looked at Harry with the blade in his hand and the focus rod against the tower and the warm white light of Glastonbury coming up around them both, and what was on her face was something Harry recognized from Merlin's letter. They will try to shape what you are into something more manageable. Not from malice, but from fear. Bellatrix Lestrange was afraid. Not of Harry. Of what Harry was. Of what it meant. Of the thing she could feel in the ground under her feet and in the resistance of the magic around her, the thing she'd thought was myth, had been told was myth, the reason Voldemort had sent her here to break the anchor before it could solidify. The sovereignty binding. Real, confirmed, growing stronger by the second as the circuit completed. She pointed her wand at him and her hand was steady and her eyes were clear and she said, "The Dark Lord will, I know what he'll do," Harry said quietly. "I'm ready for it." She held for another second. 2. The calculation in her eyes running fast and arriving at its result. She disapparated. Harry stood in the warm light of Glastonbury Tor and breathed out slowly. He looked at the disc in his hand. 6 points steady, 1, Glastonbury itself, now showing the strongest and most complete reading on the map. The 7th point was undisturbed. Had not been touched at all. She never intended to get to the 7th, Cale said. This was 2 operations, Avebury to draw you out and Glastonbury to test your limits. Bellatrix was the test. Riddle wanted to know what I could do, Harry said. He wanted to know if the old power was real. Now he knows. Harry held the sword loosely at his side and looked out over the Somerset levels stretching flat and dark in every direction, the Tor rising from them unchanged, the tower ruined but standing, the anchor burning steady and clear in the deep layer where the sovereignty binding ran. Behind him, he heard footsteps. He didn't reach for anything, because he knew the footsteps, 2 pairs, familiar, one quick and precise and one easy and deliberate. Hermione and Neville. They came over the crest of the hill together, both breathing harder than they'd prefer to admit, and stopped. They looked at the light of the anchor, still slowly fading from its peak back to its normal ambient state. They looked at Harry. At the sword. At the 2 wands he'd pocketed at Avebury, and the silver ring on his right hand, and the way the deep magic of the Tor was still running warmer than it had an hour ago. "You're all right," Hermione said. It was not a question. "I'm all right." "Bellatrix?" Neville asked. "Gone." She'll report to Voldemort. Harry sheathed the sword. He knows what he's dealing with now. Good, Neville said, and the word had a weight in his voice that hadn't been there a week ago, the weight of someone who had spent 7 days coming into their own and was not interested in any longer being careful about it. About time he did. A soft crack behind them. Dumbledore. He arrived alone, without the production of his usual entrances, in plain traveling robes, his wand out but not raised. He took in the scene, the 3 students, the sword, the settling light of the anchor, and his expression moved through several things quickly enough that Harry couldn't catalogue them all, before settling into something simply present. The anchor holds, Dumbledore said. It does, Harry said. Bellatrix retreated. She didn't break the binding. Dumbledore looked at the tower, the place where the light had come from, the 1500-year-old sovereignty binding that had just reactivated at full capacity for the first time since Arthur Pendragon had stood in this same spot and made the original claim. He looked at it for a long moment with an expression that Harry was learning to read as the man beneath the institution, the thing that Dumbledore actually felt when he wasn't managing what he felt. I owe you an apology, Dumbledore said. Not the general one I gave you in the café. A specific one. He turned to look at Harry. I knew about Glastonbury. I knew it was the primary anchor, and I knew, when I saw the Avebury evidence earlier today, that this was almost certainly a 2-side operation. I should have told you immediately. He paused. Instead I spent 40 minutes attempting to organize an order response, which is, it's what I do. It's what I have always done. And in the time it took me to organize it, you were already here. Harry looked at him. You were 40 minutes behind. Yes. Because you were organizing instead of moving. Yes. A beat. I am trying to learn a different way of responding. I am finding it more difficult than I expected, at my age. Harry was quiet for a moment, watching Dumbledore's face. The genuine effort in it. The man actively fighting his own habits. Tell me everything you know about the 7th anchor point, he said. Right now. No filtering. Dumbledore looked at him. No lessons. Know what you're ready to hear. Everything. A pause. Then, the 7th anchor point is at a location the historical records call the seat of first speaking, the site where Merlin originally articulated the deep magic framework. It is in Scotland, in the Highlands, on land that currently has no Muggle designation. The site is warded against discovery by anyone without Emery's line blood. He looked at Harry steadily. Voldemort cannot reach it. It is the one anchor point he cannot touch, because the Emery's blood ward is unbreakable without the air. A beat. It is also the site where, according to the Pendragon records, the sovereignty is considered fully consolidated. Avebury and Glastonbury confirm the binding. The 7th site completes it. Which means, Harry said, working through it, he's not going to stop attacking the other 5. No. He will systematically target every anchor he can reach, trying to weaken the binding enough that the 7th site's completion is insufficient to stabilize it. Dumbledore's voice was precisely level. He is playing a race. He knows he cannot stop you from reaching the 7th site eventually. He is trying to break enough of the others that when you do, the consolidation fails. Harry looked at the disc. 6 steady points. 7 anchors in Britain, 5 of them vulnerable, 2 of them, Avebury and Glastonbury, now reinforced and running clean and clear. How long will the reinforcements I made tonight hold? Harry asked. At Glastonbury, with the primary binding reactivated at the level I saw just now. Indefinitely, until actively broken again. Dumbledore nodded at the tower. What you did here was not a repair. It was a completion. The anchor is stronger now than it has been since the line went dormant. Avebury too, Hermione said, from behind Harry. I finished the ward reinforcement before I left. Luna helped, she can feel exactly what the stones need, which is genuinely useful. Right, Harry said. He turned the disc in his hand. We need to move to the other 5 before Voldemort does. And we need to move fast. Tonight? Neville said. Not tonight. Harry looked at him. Tonight we go back and sleep, because we've been up since 6 in the morning and making decisions while exhausted is how good plans become disasters. He looked at Dumbledore. Tomorrow you're going to give me the exact locations of the remaining 5 sites and everything you know about the wards at each one. We'll split the work, the ones with existing magical defenses can wait. The exposed ones go first. Dumbledore nodded. And I want to know about the Horcruxes, Harry said. All of them. Everything you found. He met the old man's gaze. I told you straight information, no filtering. That goes both ways. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that held something heavy. Yes, he said. All of it. Tomorrow. They stood on the summit of Glastonbury Tor as the anchor light finished fading, the deep magic settling back to its ambient state, steady and clean and running clear through the chalk and limestone and ancient earth of Somerset. Harry put the disc away. He sheathed the sword. He put his hand briefly on the stone of the ruined tower, one last time, and felt the sovereignty binding pulse once in recognition, the same way it had pulsed in his chest the first time he'd held the sword in the Pendragon vault, deep and certain as a struck bell. He turned toward the path down the hill. Let's go, he said. They were 3/4 down the Tor when Neville, walking beside Harry, said quietly, I've been thinking about what you said to Draco. That he's not his father. Yeah. I've been thinking that for a while. About my parents. He was quiet for a few steps. I spent a lot of time trying to be what my grandmother needed me to be, which was the son of Frank and Alice Longbottom. Not me. The continuation of them. He looked at the Somerset levels spread below, dark and flat. I think I'm figuring out who I actually am. Harry looked at him. How's it going? Neville thought about it. Better every day, he said honestly. This week has been, a lot. Yeah. A pause. But I feel like things fit properly. Like when Hermione said about the legend and the map. He glanced at Harry. You know what I mean. I know exactly what you mean, Harry said. They walked down the hill in the dark, the ancient land of Somerset spreading out around them, the lights of Glastonbury village below, the sky above that strange, clear black you only get far enough from cities, all the stars doing their patient work. Behind them, the Tor's single tower stood against the sky, the same it had been for centuries, the sovereignty binding running clean and new and alive in the deep earth underneath. Forward. Always forward. Chapter 6, The King's Peace. 3 days after Glastonbury, Harry sat in the Hogwarts library at a table covered in Horcrux research and felt the weight of what Dumbledore had told him settle into something workable. 7 Horcruxes. The diary, already destroyed. The ring, Dumbledore had found it in the Gaunt shack but hadn't yet destroyed it, citing the complexity of the curse on the stone, which was something Harry had read enough of Merlin's theory to understand now in a way he hadn't before. The locket. The cup. The diadem. Nagini. And the accidental one, the one that lived behind Harry's scar. Dumbledore had told him all of it at a table in his office the morning after Glastonbury, without preamble and without the layers of pedagogical framing he'd always used before. Just the facts, the locations as far as he knew them, the method of destruction, and the thing that he'd sat with longest before saying, that he believed the scar fragment was the reason the prophecy had latched onto Harry specifically, and that its removal was something he had not known how to safely approach. Harry had listened to all of it and then said, Hermione's working on the extraction method. She's been at it for 4 days. Dumbledore had looked at him with an expression that went through surprise and arrived at something that was, recognizably, hope. Is she? She is. She'll need the specific soul magic framework from the Emery sources. She has it. Another long pause. I should have thought of that, Dumbledore had said, quietly, to himself as much as Harry. Yes, Harry had agreed, without malice. You should have. The library was empty except for Hermione, who had been there since 7 in the morning, and Neville, who had arrived at 9 with food that Hermione had initially refused and then eaten without acknowledging she'd eaten. Luna was somewhere in the castle. She'd arrived at Hogwarts 2 days ago having told her father everything, and Xenophilius Lovegood had responded by immediately offering every resource the Quibbler had access to, which turned out to be more substantial than anyone had assumed. Harry was reading through the Merlin working papers again, specifically the section on soul magic theory, which sat at the intersection of the foundation layer and what Merlin had called binding debt, the magical cost of splitting a soul, the structural instability it created, and the way that instability could be used against the person who'd created it. You're looking at the wrong section, Cale said. Harry flipped back 3 pages. The soul fragment in your scar is not a standard Horcrux fragment. A standard fragment is deliberately placed into a vessel. This one, attached to a living person through the mechanism of the failed killing curse and the Lily Evans blood protection, has a different relationship with its vessel. It does not possess you. It cohabits. There's a difference. Possession requires domination, the fragment overriding the host. Cohabitation is 2 magical signatures in the same space, each maintaining their own coherence. The fragment has been with you since you were 15 months old. It has never tried to possess you because, this is the key point, it cannot. Your magical signature is too dominant. A pause. The Emery Slytherin convergence makes your baseline magic incompatible with possession. The fragment has been dormant cohabiting for 14 years because it had no mechanism to do anything else. Which means the visions. The connection. The visions are leakage through a shared magical boundary, not active manipulation. Riddle has been unaware, for most of the last 14 years, that the fragment in you was providing him with a surveillance channel. He became aware of it in your 4th year when the fragment was stimulated by the rebirth ritual. Another pause. The fragment knows what you are now. It has been experiencing the inheritance confirmation the same way you have. Through your blood. Harry looked at the ring. Is that why the scar burned when the sovereignty claim was registered? The fragment's connection to Riddle's bloodline severed partially when the Slytherin inheritance passed formally to you. The burn was the severing process. Partial, not complete, there is still a thread. But the foundation of the connection has shifted. Can Hermione extract it now? Ask her, Cale said, which was about as direct an answer as a 1,000-year-old seneschal ever gave. Harry looked across the library table. Hermione. She looked up. She had the expression she wore at the end of a complex working, not quite finished, but able to see the end from where she was. The fragment, Harry said. Are you ready? She took a slow breath. Set down her quill. Folded her hands on the table in the way she did when she was organizing her thoughts before delivering them. I've been ready for 2 days, she said. I was waiting for you to ask. Why didn't you say? Because the theory is one thing and you doing it is another, and I needed you to come to it when you were actually ready, not when I told you to be. She looked at him levelly. Are you ready? Harry thought about it honestly. Yes. Right. She stood. I need a clear space, no ambient magical interference, and, she looked around the library. Not here. The castle's background magic is too complex. I need somewhere with a simple magical environment. The room of requirement, Neville said. If you ask for a ritual space, that's what it'll give you. The room of requirement asked for a clean ritual space, provided a circular room about 30 feet across with smooth stone walls, a floor that had been swept clear of everything, and 3 candles in the corners that produced a still, clean light. No shadows from competing sources. Nothing on the walls. The kind of space that felt less like a room and more like a cleared intention. Hermione set up with the methodical care of someone who had run through this procedure in her head many times. She used chalk to draw a binding circle on the floor, not decorative, functional, each line placed with the spatial precision that the Merlin theory specified. The circle was for containment. When the fragment came out, it needed to go somewhere that wasn't the open air. Luna was in the corner. She'd followed them quietly and positioned herself at the edge of the room with the same quality she'd had at the base of the Avebury stone, not performing a role but being genuinely present to the process. Neville stood by the door. Harry sat in the center of the circle. "The fragment will resist," Hermione said. She was kneeling at the circle's edge, checking her chalk lines with the same attention she gave to essay citations. "Not because it has independent will, exactly, but because it's been in there for 14 years and extraction is," Merlin describes it as analogous to removing something that has grown partial roots. "It'll pull. Will it hurt?" Cale said it shouldn't. The process works at the foundation layer, which Merlin describes as below the pain response threshold. She looked up at him. "But I want you to tell me if something feels wrong. Not uncomfortable, wrong. Understood?" She picked up the focus rod from beside her. He'd lent it to her for this, and watching her hold it was interesting, because she held it with complete confidence and absolutely nothing happened when she did. No warmth, no attunement. It was simply wood in her hand. The focus was his, built by his ancestors' magic for his bloodline signature. "I'm going to use it as a channel for the extraction working," Hermione said. "You'll hold it when the time comes." She set it between them, on the chalk line. She began. The working was not dramatic. Harry had half expected something visible, a glow, a pulse, the kind of theatrical magic that big moments seem to produce. What Hermione did was quiet and structural, her wand moving in patterns that were more like the movements of someone adjusting a delicate instrument than casting spells. She worked at the foundation layer the way the Merlin theory described, below the incantation and intent level, touching the deep structure of the soul magic directly. Harry felt it start. A warmth at the scar, which was different from the burning, not pressure but presence, as if something that had been very still for a very long time was becoming aware of being addressed. "Take the rod," Hermione said. He picked it up. It warmed immediately in his hand, the attunement quality settling, and Hermione linked her working to his magical signature through the rod's connection and he felt the working arrive, the actual substance of it, the foundation layer reached that she'd spent a week developing, precise and deliberate and exactly calibrated to his specific magical signature. "The fragment is responding," Cale said. "Hold steady. It will not cooperate but it is also not strong enough to resist the working. It is, confused." Harry held steady. The extraction process took 11 minutes. He knew because he watched the candles and they were steady time markers in the still room. For most of it he simply sat and breathed and let Hermione work, which was the hardest part, not because it was painful but because doing nothing was actively the right response and he was not naturally inclined toward doing nothing. At the 9-minute mark, his scar burned. Not the structural burn of the sovereignty registration. The old burn, the grinding hot pressure of something being removed from a place it had occupied for 14 years. "That's the roots pulling," Hermione said, her voice controlled and entirely focused. "Don't move." He didn't move. The burn peaked at about 30 seconds and then subsided, not gradually but in a single step, like a weight being lifted, and what came after the subsiding was an absence so complete that Harry genuinely didn't know what to do with it for a moment. The fragment had been with him since before conscious memory. Its removal felt not like losing something but like the moment after a noise stops that you hadn't quite realized was constant. Silence, where there had always been a very faint, very old sound. Hermione said, "Done." He looked at the chalk circle. In its center, barely visible, a small dark point of light, not really light, more the absence of it, a point of darkness that had its own faint coherence. The fragment, extracted and contained by the binding circle. "That's it?" Neville said from the doorway. "That's it," Hermione confirmed. She sat back on her heels and allowed herself one long exhale, the controlled version of something that in a less disciplined person would have been a sigh of enormous relief. Then she picked up a small glass vial, she'd prepared it in advance, sealed with blood ward, sized for exactly this, and carefully transferred the fragment into it. The dark point moved reluctantly and then was contained. She handed the vial to Harry. He held it up to the candlelight. The fragment was barely visible, a smudge, a darkness, smaller than he'd imagined for something that had shaped so much of his life. "It is diminished," Cale said. "The moment the Slytherin inheritance transferred to you, the fragment lost most of its coherence. What remains is residual. A ghost of what it was." "How do we destroy it?" Harry asked. "Fiend fire would work," Hermione said. "But the Merlin theory suggests something cleaner, direct deep layer dissolution, using the deep speech word you've been using for hostile intention." She looked at him. Cale confirmed it would work. The word unmakers hostile intent from magic. A soul fragment is, in its fundamental nature, nothing but hostile intent given structure. One word should suffice. Harry looked at the vial. He thought about being 15 months old, and his mother's arms, and the word she'd spoken that had been love expressed as magic so deep it had cracked Voldemort's body and sent a fragment of his soul careening into the nearest living thing. He thought about 14 years of carrying it. The visions, the connection, the scar that had burned at every moment of importance since he was old enough to remember. He thought about the hill in Wiltshire at dawn, 3 days ago, sitting under the oak tree with his back to bark and the deep magic of the old land running under him, and the moment when his compass needle had settled. He uncapped the vial. He held it steady in one hand and the focus rod in the other. He spoke the deep speech word. The vial was empty. Not empty the way glass is empty when you pour something out. Empty the way a thing is empty when what was in it has simply stopped having a reason to exist. He set it down on the chalk line. Hermione looked at it, at him, at the ring on his hand and the rod in his other hand, and said nothing for a moment. Luna spoke from the corner. "The rackspurts around your scar are gone," she said. "Completely. They've been confused about that spot for as long as I've known you." She looked at his forehead with her open, direct attention. "It looks different now. Not the scar, that's still there. But the feeling around it." Harry touched his scar. The skin was the same, slightly raised, lightning bolt shaped, the physical mark that had been the first thing anyone saw when they looked at him for 15 years. Still there. Just unoccupied. "Right," he said. The meeting with the full Order of the Phoenix happened 4 days later, in the kitchen at Grimmauld Place, which had been cleaned and reorganized since Harry's last visit in a way that suggested Sirius, who'd arrived 2 days ago, having been retrieved from Azkaban and cleared with the help of the Wizengamot documentation confirming that Peter Pettigrew was alive and a named Death Eater, had been making use of his time. Sirius had received the full inheritance information with a reaction that Harry had not entirely predicted, which was laughter, genuine, unforced laughter, the laugh of a man who had spent 12 years in Azkaban and another year as a fugitive and had finally been given the right piece of information. "Your father would have been," Sirius had started, and then laughed again instead of finishing. "He would have been absolutely insufferable about this. In the best possible way." He'd pulled Harry into a hug that was tighter than it needed to be, the kind of hug from someone who had been in a very small space for a very long time. Merlin's heir. Slytherin's heir. The King of Britain. Another laugh. James Potter's son. "Don't spread the last one around," Harry had said, but he was grinning. Now Harry sat at the kitchen table with the same calm he'd been carrying since Gringotts, and the Order of the Phoenix sat around him, and the meeting had a different character than any Order meeting Harry had ever overheard or been adjacent to, because he was not here as a protected person or a subject of management. He was here to inform them. Moody was looking at him with his magical eye doing its rotating, cataloging work. Remus sat beside Sirius with an expression of careful, attentive intelligence. Tonks was at the end of the table with Kingsley, both of them Aurors who had navigated the Wizengamot fallout of the sovereignty claim with a professionalism that Harry had noted and appreciated. Molly Weasley was at the far end of the table, and her expression was complex. She had spent the last 2 weeks running the competing instincts of Harry as a child I am responsible for and Harry is clearly not, and I am figuring out how to hold both of those things at once. Arthur Weasley was watching Harry with quiet, bright eyes that had something in them Harry recognized from Augusta Longbottom's expression, the look of a person who has spent time around history and knows when they're watching it. Harry laid out the situation in the same way he'd laid everything out since Gringotts, clearly, without drama, with full information. The anchor points, 2 secured, 3 more targeted in the last 4 days and rebuffed by order teams following Harry's framework, 2 remaining. The Horcruxes, 7 total, the Scar fragment destroyed, the diary already gone, 5 remaining in various locations, the ring, the locket, the cup, the diadem, Nagini. The political situation, 7 Wizengamot recognitions formally entered, 30 days to the formal review session, Draco Malfoy not yet a declared ally but not an active opponent either. He laid out what he needed from the Order specifically, protection for the 3 vulnerable anchor points they hadn't yet reached, intelligence on the locations of the 3 physical Horcruxes, the locket was in Grimmauld Place itself, which creature confirmed under direct questioning, and the continued work of normalizing the political relationships with the Wizengamot families who had recognized the claim. Nobody talked over him. Nobody tried to redirect or qualify or wrap the information in advice he hadn't asked for. He noticed Molly make a small, private adjustment at some point during the 3rd item, a settling of her expression, a decision made internally, visible only in the slight shift of her hands on the table. Whatever the decision was, it seemed to result in her looking at him as herself rather than as someone managing him. Moody spoke first when Harry finished. The anchor point protection. I want 2-person teams, rotating. Or trained where possible. He looked around the table. I'll draw up the schedules tonight. The Horcrux search needs someone with knowledge of dark objects, Remus said. I've been working on the cup location, I have a strong lead on the Lestrange vault. Gringotts, Harry said. I'll talk to Ragnarok. The vault access is going to be complicated but he paused. I have some standing there. Tonks made a sound that was almost a laugh. Some standing. Yes. The diadem is at Hogwarts, Harry said. I found the reference in the Emery's records. Rowena Ravenclaw's diadem was hidden in the castle by Helena Ravenclaw, the Grey Lady. I know the location. Kingsley looked at him steadily. You've done a great deal in 2 weeks. I had help, Harry said, looking briefly at Hermione, Neville, and Luna, who were sitting along the far side of the table. Considerable help, Hermione said, without any false modesty, because it was accurate. The meeting wound down after another hour, logistics, assignments, the practical machinery of people who know what to do and are organizing to do it. Harry noticed that the machine ran differently when people had real information. Less anxiety in the edges of things. The particular groundedness of a group that knows the shape of its problem. When people were beginning to stand and gather, Dumbledore, who had been sitting at Harry's right and had said almost nothing during the meeting itself, spoke quietly enough that only Harry heard it. The Wizengamot review session is in 3 weeks, he said. There are things we will need to discuss before it. About what the formal role looks like in practice. The structure of how a sovereignty claim operates alongside the existing institutional framework. He looked at Harry. I want to give you that information straight. As agreed. Tuesday, Harry said. 2 o'clock. Same cafe. Dumbledore almost smiled. I'll be there. And bring everything you know about the ring Horcrux, Harry said. The curse on the stone. I want Hermione to look at it. A pause. The stone carries a resurrection enchantment. He stopped. Recalibrated, visibly, in the way Harry had been watching him do since the cafe meeting, catching the old habit of managing information and consciously choosing differently. I was concerned about the stone for reasons that are personal rather than strategic. I will bring it. Harry looked at him. Personal how? Another pause. Longer. The stone can show the dead, Dumbledore said quietly. People who are gone. I have, people I would very much like to see, even knowing the cost. Harry held that for a moment. Not the content of it but the fact of it, that Dumbledore had trusted him with a vulnerability, a private grief, the human thing underneath the institutional weight. That it had been offered without strategy, without the wrapping of lessons. "I know the feeling," Harry said. "I'll still want Hermione to look at the curse. But we'll be careful with the stone." Dumbledore nodded once, something in his expression that was not quite the careful wisdom Harry had spent 5 years receiving, something more ordinary and more real. Gratitude, maybe. Or simply the look of a man who had put something down that he'd been carrying alone for too long. The locket was found in the drawing-room cabinet of Grimmauld Place on a Tuesday morning, following a direct conversation with Creature that Harry handled himself, having spent 20 minutes beforehand reading the section in the Pendragon governance records on how the old kings had dealt with bound magical servants. The answer, it turned out, was, with respect, with clear instruction, and with the acknowledgement that a being bound in service was still a being. Harry sat down with Creature, actually sat down, at the house elf's level, in the kitchen, and talked to him about Regulus Black. Creature cried. Not theatrical crying, the wretched, private crying of something that has been holding grief alone for a very long time. Harry let him cry. He said, when it subsided, Regulus was brave. He understood what he was dealing with and he tried to stop it anyway. That matters. Creature looked at him with red-rimmed eyes the size of tennis balls. Master Harry knows about Master Regulus. Enough, Harry said. Enough to know he deserves to be remembered properly. And that you've been carrying this for 16 years without anyone acknowledging what you did. He held the house elf's gaze. You tried to complete his mission. You couldn't, because you didn't have what you needed. We have it now. He paused. Will you help us? Creature led him to the locket himself, produced from a cabinet in the drawing room with the careful reverence of something that had been kept as a memorial rather than hidden as a threat. He held it out with both hands, his enormous eyes moving between the locket and Harry with the expression of someone making an act of faith. Master Regulus would have wanted it destroyed, Creature said. Then that's what we'll do, Harry said. He took the locket. It sat in his hand with the cold, crawling malevolence of all the Horcruxes he'd now been in proximity to, the particular quality of an object that had been made to hold something that should not be held. He looked at it. The locket is interesting, Cale said. The fragment inside it knows what you are. They all know now. The scar fragment was the intelligence-gathering mechanism and it has been destroyed, but the fragments are still connected to Riddle at the soul level and they all received the information. They're afraid, Harry said. The fragments are pieces of Riddle's soul. Riddle is afraid, and they reflect that. A beat that felt like something between satisfaction and ancient sadness. Salazar would have found that poetic, I think. His name used as a weapon for decades by someone who is, fundamentally, a coward. Harry pocketed the locket. We'll deal with it the right way, he said, to Cale, to Creature, to the general principle of the thing. The destruction of the locket took place that evening in the room of requirement, which had provided, when asked for a space for the destruction of a Horcrux, something that looked more like the Emery's vault than a schoolroom, quiet, stone-walled, fireplace burning clean. Dumbledore provided the method from his research. Hermione had refined it using the Merlin theory. The basilisk venom in the Chamber of Secrets was a possibility they discussed and set aside, too volatile, too much collateral risk to the castle's structural magic. The deep layer dissolution working, the one Hermione had built for the scar fragment extraction, adapted for an object rather than a living host. The locket resisted. Of course it did. It opened its eye and produced the usual theatrical cruelty, trying fear, trying doubt, the things that Horcrux fragments generated to protect themselves. Harry held it over the prepared binding circle and looked at its open eye and said, in the deep speech, the word for the unmaking of hostile intent. The locket went still. Then the dissolution working did the rest. 5, Hermione said. 5 remaining. 4, Harry said. The diary's already gone. The locket's gone. The scar fragment's gone. He counted. Ring, cup, diadem, Nagini. 4. Hermione's mouth moved. Right. 4. A beat. That's still 4 Horcruxes. Yes, Harry said. We have the ring at Hogwarts. The diadem's in the castle. The cup is in the Lestrange vault. He looked at the ceiling. And Nagini is with Voldemort. We'll deal with Nagini when we deal with him, Neville said, from the corner where he'd been standing during the locket destruction with the steady readiness of someone who'd stopped being surprised by the scale of things. Yes, Harry agreed. We will. The Wizengamot review session was the last Monday of July. Harry arrived at the Ministry with Hermione, Neville, and Luna, and this time there were no Aurors at the door of the courtroom because the Ministry security desk, which was now staffed by a witch who had been briefed by Kingsley, who had been briefed by Harry's legal filings, which had been prepared by Hermione with the thoroughness of someone who had once spent a year researching magical law for recreational purposes, had his name on a pre-authorized list. The badge read Harry James Potter Emery's Pendragon, Sovereign Claimant. Someone in the badge printing office had made a decision. The chamber was full. Every ancient and noble house seat occupied, not by proxies this time. The full Wizengamot, called to a formal review session, which happened approximately once a decade and for which attendance was not technically mandatory but was, given what was on the agenda, apparently sufficiently compelling that even the members who'd spent the last 3 weeks hoping it would go away had turned up. The gallery was standing room. Harry didn't look up. He walked to the center of the chamber floor and stood there, and around the horseshoe he could feel the oath pull running from 29 seats with the consistent, directional quality that Draco had described as knowing which way north was. 29 directions all pointing toward the same point. He was the point. Fudge was absent. This was not a surprise. Fudge had resigned 4 days ago, the details of which Hermione had explained to Harry in the tone she used for events that were satisfying even when she was trying to be neutral. Fudge's resignation had been precipitated by the official Wizengamot record of Harry's statement about Voldemort's return being confirmed publicly, on the record, by the 3 Aurors who had attended the events of June and had been waiting for institutional permission to say what they'd seen. Kingsley had provided that permission by filing a formal Aura incident report that the now tottering ministry could not suppress. The acting minister was Amelia Bones, who had been the Bones matriarch in the chamber 3 weeks ago and one of the first 6 formal recognitions. She sat in the minister's seat with the competent directness of someone who had been waiting for the people ahead of her to finish making a mess so she could clean it up. Umbridge was also absent. The details of her absence were more complicated and more satisfying, involving a full investigation into her unauthorized use of ministry resources and authority during her tenure at Hogwarts, which had been formally opened 48 hours ago. She had been suspended pending review. Harry looked around the chamber. The 32 days since his first appearance here had changed the room's quality. The anxiety was still present. This was a room full of people facing a political reality they hadn't entirely processed, but the particular hostility of that first session, the Fudge and Umbridge energy of people using procedure as a weapon, was gone. What was here instead was attention. Real, careful, collective attention. He had their attention the way things have attention when they are real. The review session, the clerk announced, is convened to formally enter and address the sovereignty claim filed by Harry James Potter Emery's Pendragon on the 24th of July. They set down their parchment. The claimant is recognized. Harry let the silence sit for a beat. Then he said, I want to talk about the war. Not the claim. Not the legal framework, not the procedural history of the Pendragon succession. The war. Tom Riddle, Voldemort, returned to full power in June. You know this. Many of you have known it for months and have been unable to say so officially because the institutional framework around you was being run by people who found the truth inconvenient. He looked around the horseshoe steadily. That's over. He is back, he is actively operating, and he has spent the last 3 weeks attacking the physical anchor points of the Pendragon sovereignty binding, the ancient magical sites that are part of Britain's foundational deep magic structure. He has done this because he understands what my inheritance means for his ability to claim the power he has been building toward. He reached inside his robes and placed the Gringotts documentation on the clerk's desk. The inheritance is confirmed. The claim is real. The anchor points are, with the exception of 2 sites that are currently being stabilized by teams I've organized with the Order of the Phoenix and with Auror Cooperation, secure. He looked at Amelia Bones. I am requesting the formal cooperation of the Ministry's Auror Division in the protection of those sites and in the active prosecution of the war against Voldemort's organization. Not as a favor. As the function this institution was built to perform. He looked at Dumbledore. Dumbledore was in his chief warlock seat, which he had continued to occupy on Harry's explicit request. You know this institution from the inside better than anyone, and I need that knowledge working for us, not sitting on the sidelines. He was watching Harry with the open, unperforming attention he'd been developing over the last 3 weeks, and he inclined his head, slightly, when Harry looked at him. The acknowledgement of someone who has chosen to stop managing and start serving. The Horcruxes, Harry said, turning back to the chamber. Voldemort has created 7. 3 are already destroyed. 4 remain. I am not going to explain the mechanism in a public forum, but the individuals with need to know have been briefed. He let a beat fall. The path to ending this war is clear. We have what we need to walk it. What we have not had, until now, is institutional coherence, people working toward the same end with the same information, instead of different factions managing their own corners of a crisis that requires collective response. Tiberius Ogden spoke from his seat. What are you asking this body to do? 3 things, Harry said. First, formal ministry declaration that Voldemort has returned and is an active threat. No more managing public perception. No more institutional silence. People deserve to know what they're facing. A beat. Second, full Auror resources directed at the war, under a command structure that reports to the minister rather than being managed through political channels. Kingsley Shacklebolt as head of Auror operations. He discussed this with Amelia Bones the previous day, her expression now confirmed she'd heard it and was in agreement. Third, formal amnesty for individuals who join Voldemort's organization under coercion or underage, with a truth verification process for separating coerced service from willing participation. He held up a hand at the murmur this produced. I am not asking for blanket forgiveness. I am asking for a fair process, because a lot of people made bad decisions under pressure, and a justice system that doesn't distinguish between pressure and choice is not serving justice. The murmur in the chamber was not hostile. It was the sound of 50 people processing something and finding it reasonable, which was different. Amelia Bones said, the acting minister supports all 3 proposals. The Wisengamot will vote. The votes took 22 minutes. All 3 passed. He was in the corridor outside the chamber afterward, the same corridor where Draco Malfoy had found him 3 weeks ago, when footsteps came from the direction of the member exit. Not hurrying. Not the footsteps of someone approaching with challenge or calculation. He turned. Draco Malfoy was in the corridor with a woman Harry recognized as Narcissa Malfoy, tall, composed, the pale Malfoy coloring wearing a different expression than Harry had ever seen Lucius Malfoy wear, something more private and more genuine. Draco looked like he hadn't slept particularly well in 3 weeks. He also looked like someone who had made a decision and was in the process of finding out if it was the right one. My father, Draco said, without preamble, is at the manor. He has committed to Riddle in ways that I cannot undo for him. I am not asking you to undo it. He held Harry's gaze with the particular effort of someone working against a lifetime of performing ease they don't feel. I am telling you that the House of Malfoy's formal position, as of this morning, is that I am its head. My mother and I filed the papers 4 days ago. A pause that cost him something. Lucius has been relieved of the headship. On grounds of action prejudicial to the family's ancient obligations. Harry looked at Narcissa, who looked back at him with grey eyes that were nothing like Draco's in expression but everything like them in color, and said, quietly, "The Malfoy family has served its oath poorly for 30 years. We are choosing to serve it better." She said this with the dignity of someone who knows the cost of what they're admitting and has decided the admission is worth it. Harry held her gaze for a moment and found in it something he recognized, the same thing Dumbledore had shown him in the café, the same thing Augusta had shown him in the Longbottom sitting room. A person who had been one thing and was now, with full understanding of the weight of it, choosing to be another. "The House of Malfoy is recognized," Harry said. "Not forgiven. Not cleared." Recognized, the specific term from the Pendragon court protocol, the acknowledgement that an oath had been answered, the obligation met. Something in Draco's face shifted. The relief was visible for exactly 1 second before the Malfoy composure reasserted itself, which was about 1 second longer than Draco would have preferred. "We have information," Draco said. "About Riddle's operations. The Horcrux locations, I know where the cup is, specifically. Lestrange Vault, Gringotts, level 9. He said it briskly, the information delivered with the efficiency of someone who has been holding it and wants it to be useful before they can change their mind. There are also 3 safe houses he uses in rotation. I know the addresses. Write them down, Harry said. Give them to Hermione, she'll make sure they get to Kingsley. Draco produced a folded piece of parchment that he'd clearly prepared in advance. Handed it to Hermione, who took it and looked at it with the rapid eye movement of someone cataloging while appearing to be just looking. Then Draco looked at Harry with the directness that had always been his best quality when it wasn't being used as a weapon. "What do you need from us?" he asked. Harry thought about it. "The same thing I need from everyone who's chosen the right side," he said. "Show up. Do the work. Don't make me explain the same thing twice." Draco looked at him for a moment. Something moved across his face that was not quite a smile but occupied some of the same space. "I can manage that," he said. The Highlands of Scotland were cold even in late July. The seat of first speaking was not on any map, it was on the bronze disc, the 7th point, burning with a steady warm light that had been getting stronger as Harry traveled north with Hermione, Neville, and Luna. The site, when they found it, was exactly what Dumbledore had described and nothing like what Harry had expected, not dramatic, not monumental. A spring, in a clearing, in the middle of a stand of old oak trees. The water came up through a crack in the granite and collected in a natural basin before running away north down the hillside. Ordinary water, clear and cold, in a stone basin that had been shaped not by hands but by centuries of the water's own movement. But the deep magic here, Harry stood at the edge of the clearing and breathed. The deep magic here was not the steady river of Avebury or the column of Glastonbury. It was the source. The actual source, the place where, 1500 years ago, Merlin had stood and spoken the first organized articulation of the magical world's foundational framework, had taken the deep speech and the foundation layer and made it communicable, had built the grammar that everything else rested on. He could feel it running through the ground, through the air, through the water in the spring, the same way blood runs through a body, not going anywhere but simply being everywhere it was supposed to be. "This is the place," Cale said, very quietly. Not the voice of a bound intelligence managing a new owner. Something older and more private than that. Salazar came here once. Just once, before the founding of Hogwarts. He stood here and felt what you are feeling, and he said, a pause. He said that if he had known this existed when he was young, he would have spent his life differently. What did he mean? Harry asked. He spent his life afraid, Cale said simply. Afraid of loss, of contamination, of the magical world being destroyed by those who didn't value it. His ideology came from fear. All the worst things he did came from fear. Another pause. Standing here, he understood, briefly, that what he was afraid of losing couldn't be lost. That it was here. That it was a source, not a finite thing. A long beat. He told me about it afterward. He said he wished he could have felt it longer. Harry stood at the spring and listened to this, and thought about Voldemort, Tom Riddle, who had spent his entire life afraid of death, who had taken that fear and made it into something that consumed everything it touched, who had broken his soul into 7 pieces trying to escape the one thing that everyone faced, and thought about the difference between a person who was afraid of losing something and a person who understood that some things couldn't be lost. He knelt at the spring. He put his hand in the cold water. The 7th anchor activated. Not like Glastonbury, not a surge, not a visible thing. The sovereignty binding completed itself with the stillness of something that was always already true and was simply being acknowledged. The 7 points on the bronze disc lit simultaneously, the whole pattern of the binding visible in the disc surface, all 7 steady and bright and running clean. Harry looked at the disc and felt the completion not as triumph but as settlement. The thing that the hill in Wiltshire had started, 3 days after Gringotts, sitting under the oak tree with the deep magic of the old land running under him. The process of becoming what he was, fully, without reservation. He stood up. His hand was cold and wet from the spring. He wiped it on his jeans. Done. Neville said. Done. Hermione was very still at the edge of the clearing. When Harry looked at her she had the expression she got when something moved her that she wasn't going to perform, the compressed emotion, the careful neutrality of someone who is feeling a great deal and has decided to feel it privately. She met his eyes and gave him, once, the small nod of someone who has been with something from the beginning and knows what this moment represents. Luna was crouching at the spring, trailing her fingers in the water with the interest of someone discovering something genuinely delightful. The water tastes different, she said. It has a sound. Very old, very clear. She looked up at Harry. Like you, actually. Since you got here. That's a strange thing to say, Neville said. I know, Luna agreed cheerfully. It's true, though. Harry looked at the spring, at the stone basin worn smooth by 1,500 years of patient water. He thought about what came next, the 4 remaining Horcruxes, the war, the Wisengamot review, Dumbledore and his careful, ongoing unlearning of old habits, Draco and his uncomfortable, genuine recalibration, Sirius laughing in the Grimmauld Place kitchen, Augusta Longbottom in her family seat, Bellatrix on the tour knowing what she'd felt and reporting it to a master who now, for the first time in decades, had something to genuinely fear. He thought about Voldemort getting the report. Understanding, finally and fully, what he was dealing with. Not a chosen one built for this purpose. Not a weapon shaped by circumstance. Something older and more fundamental, an heir, a convergence, a sovereignty that had been building through 15 centuries of patient bloodline convergence and had arrived, finally, in the specific person of a 15-year-old boy who had walked into Gringotts on a Tuesday morning on a hunch. The war wasn't over. It was, in fact, only just beginning to be fought on honest terms. Voldemort had the Horcruxes and the Death Eaters and the particular cunning of a man who had spent 50 years treating death as a problem to be solved rather than a reality to be lived with. He was not finished and he was not broken. But he was, for the first time, genuinely afraid. That was enough to work with. Harry turned to his 3 companions. Let's go home, he said. Hermione, walking back through the Highland clearing, said, when school starts in September, how exactly are you planning to handle being both a 15-year-old 5th-year student and the sovereign claimant of the magical monarchy of Britain? No idea, Harry said. I'll figure it out. You'll have OWLs. I know. You cannot use ancient kingship as an excuse to not sit your OWLs. I would never. You would absolutely try, she said. I'm noting it in advance. Neville said, I think the bigger question is whether Snape is going to treat Harry differently now. Snape will not treat Harry differently, Hermione said flatly. Snape will absolutely not treat Harry differently, Harry agreed, and they were both right, and somehow that was one of the most reassuring things about the entire situation. Luna was walking slightly behind them with her Quibbler, the new issue, the one her father was printing this week, with the headline Harry Potter, king of magic and the truth about the ancient bloodlines, which was going to cause a considerable amount of conversation when it landed on doorsteps across Britain tomorrow morning, tucked under her arm. She said, to no one in particular, the Raxperts in this part of Scotland are very small and very polite. It's a good sign. They walked back through the Highland oak trees in the late afternoon light, 4 of them, heading south, and behind them the spring ran clear and cold over its ancient granite, carrying the deep magic of the world the same way it always had, patient, fundamental, undiminished by anything that had been done to obscure or deny or fear it. It had been here before the Ministry. It had been here before Hogwarts. It had been here before any of the structures that magical Britain used to organize itself. It would be here after the war. That was the thing about sources, they didn't care about the arguments happening downstream. They just kept running. 600 miles south, in a cold house in the Scottish lowlands where Tom Riddle sat among his followers and received the report from Bellatrix with the controlled, precise attention of a man who had spent 30 years treating fear as something that happened to other people, Tom Riddle felt the 7th anchor point activate. He felt it the way you feel a door close. Definitive. The sound of a mechanism completing itself. He sat with this for a long time. Around him, his followers waited in silence because he had not spoken, and the quality of his not speaking was something none of them were experienced with, not anger, not calculation, not the prelude to an instruction. Something different. Something that, in any other person, they might have called reckoning. He thought about a 15-year-old boy who had walked into Gringotts on a Tuesday morning. He thought about the basilisk in the chamber, and the graveyard, and the connection through the scar that had shown him things he hadn't wanted to see, a boy who did not perform courage but simply acted, a boy whose magic moved differently from any magic Tom had ever catalogued, a boy who had looked at the weight of what he'd inherited and asked, first of all, what was in the vaults. He thought about the sword on the tor, transparent and ancient, and the way the ground had responded to the air's touch, and Bellatrix's face when she'd come back. Voldemort was not a man who admitted that other people had something he didn't. But in the cold house, in the silence his followers were carefully maintaining, he acknowledged, to himself only, in the private space where all true reckonings happen, that the landscape of the war had changed. That the boy who had been built as a weapon had discovered he was something older and less manageable than a weapon. That the question now was not whether Tom Riddle was powerful enough to win. The question was whether Tom Riddle was brave enough to face what he was actually fighting. He thought about that for a long time. He did not have an answer. That, more than anything, frightened him.